Mayen is a small volcanic island in the Arctic Ocean. In the present day, it's a part of Norway, but has no permanent population, only temporary residents ranging from about 18 to 35 across the year. In the game Victoria 2, Mayen is a part of Sweden and starts off with a grand total of 15 pops. Despite that, the island contains cores of a releasable nation which is also called Mayen. This is an Easter egg nation whose main gimmick is that it's supposedly ruled by polar bears, which is reflected by a unique accepted culture. Unfortunately, due to its extremely low population, there isn't much you can actually do when playing as them. You can't raise armies, build an industry, or earn any money from taxes or tariffs. In order to make this nation even remotely playable, the devs implemented a special decision called the Polar Bear Purchase, which allows you to buy Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands from Denmark, provided you manage to become at least a secondary power first. But even with this boost, your population will still be too small to recruit any armies or establish a significant industrial base, so in the end you won't be much better off. For these reasons, Mayen is little more than a joke country, and if you play as them, you're not expected to be able to accomplish much at all. So anyway, I conquered the world as Mayen. Yes, I actually did it. I took a tiny island of 15 people, and in a little under 100 years, I had placed literally the entire world under their banner. This was done in Vanilla Heart of Darkness version 3.04, without modifying the game in any way or using any cheats for the in-game console. I did make extensive use of all the most broken exploits the game has to offer, but all I did were things that are possible to do within the constraints of the game itself, whether it was intended by the developers or not. There is, however, one thing I did do that might arguably compromise the legitimacy of the run, and that is save scumming. I normally forbid myself from save scumming when doing challenge runs like these, but for this challenge I had decided from the start that I would allow myself to do it if I felt I had to. I still tried to keep save scumming to a minimum, and I actually managed to make it almost halfway through the campaign without doing it once. But as I approached the late game, that clean track record unfortunately went down the drain. But at least for me, the important thing is to demonstrate that a Mayen world conquest is indeed possible, and with slightly better luck and more careful play, it could certainly be done with no save scumming at all. Anyway, upon hearing of this accomplishment, I imagine there are two questions many of you may be asking. How and why? Well, if we start with the second question, some time ago I was casually browsing the top rated posts of all time on the Victoria 2 subreddit when I came across this post, where the OP had come up with their own achievements for the game since it doesn't have any official ones. One of these was called One Mountain and had a description as Mayen conquered world. This was obviously a reference to the Europa Universalis 4 achievement, the Three Mountains, which also requires you to conquer the world as a small island nation. In the comment section under the post, there were several people stating that this hypothetical achievement would be literally impossible. And when I see someone state with confidence that something in this game would be impossible to do, there's a part of me that immediately goes, I gotta try that. Plus, I just figured it would be a pretty big flex to take the objectively weakest country in the game and complete a challenge that has only been done 3 times in the entire history of this game. As for the question of how I did this, well, that's what I'll be dedicating the rest of this video to explaining. But as you may know, this isn't the first time I conquered the world in this game. A few years ago I did a world conquest of Germany, and in conjunction with that I released a video explaining all the important tricks and strategies which made that accomplishment possible. If you haven't seen that one, I'd probably recommend you go watch it first, as most of what I talked about in that video also applies to this run, and to avoid repeating myself I won't go into too much detail on the more general world conquest strategies in this video. Also, I'd just like to mention real quick that the run I'll be describing here is actually my second proper attempt at a Mayen world conquest. The first attempt was streamed live on my Twitch channel, But after this failed about halfway through, for reasons I'll talk about later, I decided to do my second attempt offline, so I could focus entirely on the rather demanding gameplay without having to worry about being entertaining on stream. For that reason, while I have uploaded the full unedited gameplay footage to an unlisted playlist on my second channel, I don't expect it will be very fun to watch all the way through, as it's just pure gameplay with no commentary or anything. It's mostly there for documentation purposes, but I'll nonetheless link to it in the description if anyone wants to check it out. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the run. To start the campaign off, I had to initially select to play as Sweden, but I didn't actually do anything as Sweden before releasing and switching to play as Mayen, so this was as pure of a Mayen run as the game allows. As I explained in the intro, Mayen's practically non-existent population doesn't allow you to do very much at all in the beginning. The one thing they got going for them is their incredibly high literacy at 80%, which allows them to research new technologies quite quickly. The standard way to play Mayen is therefore to rush to technologies that give you bonus prestige in the hopes of gaining enough to become a secondary power. This then allows you to take the polar bear purchase decision to buy Iceland and Greenland from Denmark, something which will cost you £4,000. Besides giving you more land, the decision also has the effect of promoting polar bears from a mere accepted culture into your primary culture, and instantly assimilating all your pops into polar bears. This doesn't have much impact on gameplay, but it does cause all new leaders you recruit to have portraits of polar bears along with bear-themed names, which is just delightful. Now that you own a second state, you'll be eligible to become a great power. So the next step is typically to continue researching prestige techs and hope that'll be enough to reach rank 8. Once you're a great power, you have the option to sphere Sweden and Denmark and then form Scandinavia. But if you want to remain as Mayen, another option is to make some allies and then get them to fight wars of conquest on your behalf. This will hopefully give you some sufficiently populous land to let you raise armies of your own and then go from there. The problem with these strategies in the context of a world conquest is that they're simply too slow. You can't afford to wait several decades to begin conquering things if you're gonna complete a challenge like this before the end date. So I knew that if there was going to be any chance of success, I had to find a way to get going a lot quicker than that. And after some experimentation, I managed to find a way. You see, there actually is one more thing besides research that you can do as Mayen. You may not be able to build any armies, but what you can build is ships. I have no idea who is supposed to be manning these ships, but they can be built nonetheless. As such, I began the run by ordering the construction of 3 Clipper transports. Obviously I didn't have anything to actually transport, but since you don't have any way to make more money in the beginning, you have to make do with the £5,100 you start with. The Clipper transports are significantly cheaper than any other ship type. While waiting for them to build, I immediately started my very first war justification of the run, targeting Morocco. Once that's finished, I declared war to conquer the state of Al Rif, and sent my fleet down toward North Africa. Without an army, my only means of gaining war score was via blockades. Morocco thus made for a convenient target, since they're relatively close by and have a lot of coast. But can you really enforce a surrender through blockade war score alone? Well, as it turns out, the answer is no. No, you can't. When evaluating whether to accept a peace offer, the AI looks not only at your current war score, but also takes into account your relative army strength. If you have no army at all, the relative army strength between yourself and the AI is always going to be maximally in your favor, which means they'll pretty much never accept any peace deal no matter how much war score you manage to accrue through other means. So rather than waste strength on futile blockades, I ordered my ships to take refuge in some nearby Spanish ports, and then I waited. And after a few months, the thing I was waiting for came to fruition, as Spain declared their own war against Morocco. The reason I needed this to happen is because, apparently, when the AI evaluates relative army strength for accepting a peace deal in one war, they don't just look at the enemy armies involved in that particular war, Rather, they look at the combined army strength of everyone they're at war with. In other words, even though I don't have an army myself, Morocco takes into account Spain's army size when deciding whether to accept my peace offers. This, combined with the 11 war score I got from my blockades, eventually allowed me to do this. This, right here, is the single most important step of the entire campaign. This small piece of land might not be much, but it is something. By annexing it, I went from having zero income to having some income, and from being able to recruit 0 regiments to being able to recruit some regiments. And unlike the more traditional Mayen strategies, I reached this state in less than 2 in-game years. To be perfectly honest, I myself was very skeptical about the possibility of a Mayen world conquest even as I began experimenting with it. It wasn't until I discovered how to achieve this first bit of expansion that I began to take the whole idea more seriously. I should mention though that what you're seeing here is by no means my first attempt at getting the run going. While Spain often declares war on Morocco within the first few years of the game, it's not guaranteed, and the odds of them declaring the war as early as I need them to are even lower. As such, I had to restart and replay this first segment many times before it worked out in my favor. And even after this point, there's a lot that can go wrong and lead to even more restarts within the first 15 years or so. But this is the only viable way I found to get an attempt off the ground, so I just had to deal with it. Immediately upon annexing Al Rif, I inherited 3 regiments of irregulars from Morocco. I'm not completely sure, but this seems to be something that happens when you annex a territory from a country while they are busy fighting another war. You simply take over ownership of all regiments hailing from the newly annexed territory, without needing to recruit them from scratch. I still ended up disbanding one of the irregulars and replacing it with a unit of basic cavalry, since I wanted the recon bonus. In case you're wondering why I didn't disband all of them and replace them with even better unit types like infantry and dragoons, that's because my economy simply wasn't strong enough to support such troops, and I'd quickly run out of money if I tried. Now, although 3 regiments are a lot better than none, it's obviously not going to be enough to conquer the world on its own. I could have used this as a starting point to gradually take on bigger and bigger foes until I was strong enough to defeat even the great powers of the world. But that would probably take a long time, and time is a very precious resource in a run like this. So for my next target, I had to find a country with a population vastly outnumbering my own, but which I would somehow be able to conquer using only these 3 regiments and some ships. Luckily, I happen to know of just one such country, Japan. But in order to conquer Japan, I first needed to reach it, and that presented a problem. If I were to simply load my armies onto some transports and attempt to sail them the entire way there, the fleet would inevitably perish from naval attrition before they even got close. This would be avoidable if I could only get military access for someone who owns ports along the route, but as it stood, nobody was willing to offer me that. The only reason I managed to get access from Spain earlier was due to fighting a common enemy, but now that I was at peace, I'd have no such luck. So what do we do when the game tells us there's a certain course of action we can't take? That's right. We say, fuck you game, and we do it anyway. All we need is a little help from an exploit which I like to call the Fleet of Theseus. If you have a fleet consisting of a number of ships, and one by one you replace every ship they're in with a new identical ship, is it still the same fleet? Well, according to Victoria 2, the answer is yes, and we can infer that by looking at the time at sea attrition modifier. This is a modifier which is applied to a fleet when it's outside of supply range. It starts at 1% and increases by an additional 2% every month that the fleet remains outside of that range. As it turns out, this modifier is tied to the fleet itself, rather than the individual ships. So if you replace every ship in the fleet with new identical ones, they will immediately suffer from the accumulated time at sea modifier of the fleet, even if the ships themselves are fresh out of port. On the flip side, if the old ships are transferred over to a new fleet, their attrition modifier will be immediately reset to 1% no matter how long the ships themselves have been at sea. And here's the kicker. When you choose to create a new fleet by splitting off ships from an existing one, you don't actually need to leave any ships in the original fleet. This fact enables an exploit where you sail a fleet outside of supply range until its time at sea modifier rises above the base value. Then you create a new fleet and transfer all the ships over to it while leaving nothing in the original fleet. This can be done an unlimited number of times and effectively resets the attrition modifier each time you do it. So even though the journey from Morocco to Japan would normally be impossible due to the time at sea modifier, using this exploit I can pull off the same journey while barely suffering any attrition at all. It required a lot of tedious micro, but was well worth it. The only limitation to this exploit is that you can't split up a fleet that is currently transporting troops. As such, I had to find a different way to get my armies to Japan. This was easily accomplished through a different exploit, where I made use of the military access I still had from Spain to move my troops into the province Melilla. Then I cancelled the access, which made the army exiled. When an army is exiled, they're free to move anywhere in the world, so I could then simply order them to walk all the way across North Africa and Asia to the southern coast of Korea, where they could meet up with the transports that had been sent via the sea route. While this was going on, I'd also been doing some reform management. Throughout the early game, my upper house went back and forth between being dominated by reactionaries and being dominated by more progressive ideologies. While it was more progressive, I took the opportunity to pass certain social reforms like healthcare and education, which gave some useful bonuses. But while it was more reactionary, I actually deliberately rolled back as many political reforms as I could. The reason for this is actually to benefit my militancy management long term, as the more reforms I roll back now, the more reforms I can pass again later when rebels start to organize en masse. Since militancy is temporarily reduced each time you pass a reform, it's the most efficient way to prevent rebellions down the line. Anyway, despite all this talk of Japan, they technically weren't the next country I declared war on. Shortly before I commenced my invasion of them, I actually declared war on Haiti. This was done for the sole purpose of luring the USA into an intervention trap. You see, the USA tends to begin influencing Japan pretty early in the game, and it's not unlikely they'll manage to reach a friendly opinion with them before I can finish my war. This would enable USA to intervene on Japan's behalf and ruin my ambitions. But USA can't intervene in the Japan war if they're already at war with me, or if we have a truce. I could make this happen by simply declaring war on USA directly, but that would run the risk of them deciding to add some nasty war goal on me, such as cut down the size. A safer option then is to declare war on another nation they are friendly with and have them intervene there instead, as that would limit them to the relatively harmless status quo war goal and allow me to end the war anytime I like. Haiti happens to be an ideal target for this, since they're close enough that I can reach to placate them and gain the war score needed for USA to intervene, while also being weak enough that I can reliably block them from naval invading my capital on their own. As soon as USA was about to reach friendly opinion in Japan, I sent a single frigate to Haiti, gained some blockade war score, and let USA intervene. Then I accepted their status quo peace offer and was thus safe from any further interventions for the next 5 years. As for Japan, I specifically chose them as my next target of conquest for 2 reasons. 1, they have a high population, and 2, there's a way to cheese your way to a complete victory against them without having to fight a single battle if everything goes to plan. That cheese is called an island trap, and it involves making landfall on one of Japan's smaller islands, occupying a province or 2 while your ships block Japan's army from crossing the straits, then evacuating your army while allowing the Japanese to cross over. By first doing a few bait maneuvers of quickly unblocking and then reblocking the straits, you can get the Japanese AI to bunch up pretty much their entire army next to the straits, so that when you finally unblock them for real, they'll send everything they have across at once. Then you simply block the straits again, and just like that, the island trap has been sprung. In an ideal scenario, this would then allow you to freely occupy the rest of the country without facing any opposition. But in my case, Japan had not yet built up to the force limit when the war began, and so they kept recruiting new armies that I would not have the chance to trap. Thankfully, I was able to pick them off one by one as they appeared, so they never became a serious threat. But it did slow down the occupation process a fair bit. Nonetheless, I was able to slowly occupy the main island one province at a time, while adding war goals to annex their 4 most populous states. After about 5 years of this, I was keen to end the war, but Japan still stubbornly refused to surrender. So that's when I decided to expedite things with the help of yet another new exploit. I made a save at the current date, resigned back to the main menu, then loaded up the save I just made. Lo and behold, after letting the game run for one in-game day, Japan was suddenly willing to surrender after all. Apparently, reloading a save file causes the AI to reevaluate their willingness to make peace, and for whatever reason, this tends to result in them becoming much more willing to make peace than they were before. I have no idea why this works, and it's something I just happened to discover by chance while working on my first world conquest attempt as young Mayen. But it sure is very handy at times like these. After this Japanese conquest, my force limit immediately jumped up by a whole 20 regiments, and my economy improved on a similar scale. But as impressive as that might sound relative to what I had before, it's still nowhere near enough to get this world conquest going for real. No, for that I would have to aim a lot higher. You see, all the conquest and acquisition of military strength I've done thus far in the run had all been for one specific purpose: to become strong enough to fight China. Because of course it was. This is Vanilla Vic 2. You either start the game as a great power, or you immediately go conquer stuff from China until you become one. That's just the way it works. And as you should know if you've ever watched my channel before, the best way to get at China is to go through their ally Korea. So after my war with Japan concluded, I began justifying war on them. The reason you don't want to declare war on China directly is because then they would be able to call their substates into the war as well. But if you attack one of China's allies, then you only need to fight China itself. Another useful side effect of this is that if China's substates are not involved in the war, then China will never send any troops into Korea until you annex them, so you can safely finish up with them and then turn your full attention to the Chinese. I should also mention that this war with Korea is another reason why I wanted a truce with the USA, since in addition to Japan, they also tend to become friendly with Korea early on, and thus may end up intervening against you there as well. Once Korea is annexed, China will start sending troops your way. My strategy for fighting them mostly involved baiting them in and destroying one army at a time. I kept this up for a while, but eventually stopped, by parking 3 armies along the border to discourage any more Chinese troops from coming in. That's because by then, I had achieved the 2 things I wanted to get out of these battles. Farm enough prestige to ensure I'd be a great power by the year 1850, I'll explain why that's important later, and reach 50 war score from battles, which is the maximum you can get that way. The battle war score alone would not be enough to completely win the war, but when I annexed Korea, China automatically added 4 free people war goals on me to liberate their ally. And after a 2-year grace period, those war goals would begin to generate negative ticking war score for China since they weren't able to fulfill them. Of course, I had to add some war goals of my own, but I deliberately waited to do that until shortly before the grace period for China's war goals would run out. That's because it would be impractical for me to actually occupy the states I'd be demanding. So if I had added the war goals too early, I too would begin to suffer negative tickers to my war score. On the other hand, adding them too late wouldn't be good either, since when you add new war goals, any negative ticking war score accumulated by your enemy is reset to 0. So the optimal time to add my war goals was just before China's negative tickers set in, as that gave me the longest possible grace period before my own negative tickers would set in, but without disrupting the accumulation of negative war score on China's side. Once some more time had passed, these negative tickers, combined with a bunch of blockades and a daring occupation of their capital Beijing, had brought China close to surrender. But to give them that final little push, I once again made use of the save reload exploit to make them willing to surrender immediately. When all was said and done, I had managed to conquer no less than 5 states from them in addition to annexing Korea. As a result, the army I'd had following my war with Japan had now quadrupled in size. While this might already have been enough to get the world conquest started, I knew that long term it would be beneficial to take the time to grow my army even bigger. Thus, I immediately began justifying war on China's other ally, Tainan, which both circumvented my truce with China and provided yet another way to get into war with them without having to fight their substates. Now that I owned land right in the middle of China and could field an army much larger than before, the simplest way to approach this war would be to first focus on wiping all of China's armies and then simply occupy the remainder of their country. Unfortunately, I couldn't allow myself to do that, since if I wiped all of their armies, they would very likely get a big rebellion, and if that rebellion were to succeed, all of China's substate would become independent. The best way to conquer the Chinese substates is to force a rebellion in China while you're at war with both them and their substates, since if the substates become independent during such a war, you can add conquest war goals and piece them out separately, thus annexing them all in a single war. If they become independent before then, I'd have to waste time conquering them over the course of multiple wars instead. For that reason, I tried my best to kill as few Chinese armies as possible while relying mostly on ticking war score from occupied war goals to bring me victory. This seemed to work quite well, but then I made one grave error. When choosing which states to demand a peace deal, I carelessly left them with one isolated exclave disconnected from their capital. When the war ended and most of China's armies became exiled within my territories, they proceeded to march straight into this little exclave and got stuck there. As such, when a rebellion did rise up around Beijing a short while later, those armies could do nothing to stop it, and so all substates ended up independent after all. This marked the first significant mistake of the run, and unfortunately it would not be the last. Aside from that little hiccup though, things thus far had mostly gone to plan, and I was finally ready to move on from the power-up phase of the run. But there's one thing I should address first. I've been doing a lot of conquesting in a relatively short amount of time here, so how come my infamy is, non-existent? Well, that is thanks to one of the most egregiously broken exploits in the game, the fake release exploit, also known as the infinite infamy glitch. I've already explained the mechanics of this exploit in an earlier video of mine, the one about my Krakow into Poland-Lithuania speedrun, so I'll just include a clip from that video here. In Victoria 2, you can get rid of a bit of infamy by releasing puppets from your own territory, specifically 5 infamy per puppet released. Normally this can only be done once per puppet, and is thus fairly limited. When you release a puppet, they will gain every one of their core provinces that you own, with one possible exception. If they have a core on your capital province, you will still retain ownership of it. But what if you're playing a country that only has one province, such as Krakow, and there is a releasable nation with a core on it, such as Poland? Well, as it turns out, Poland still shows up in the list of releasable nations, and if you click the button, the game will act as if you released them, including reducing your infamy by 5. But since the only Polish core you own is your capital, Poland ends up getting no provinces at all. And since they have no provinces, you still have the option to release them again. And again. And again. The result is that you have a never-ending source of infamy reduction at your disposal, as long as Poland doesn't get released from someone else or you obtain any other Polish core provinces. The only limitation is that you can only release puppets when you're at peace, so you have to take care not to exceed the infamy limit during a war. So yeah, that's how it works. The problem with this exploit is that it can only be used in very specific circumstances. In fact, out of all the nations that exist on the map in 1836, Krakow is the only one that can make use of it. But if we include releasable tags as well, then there is one more option, namely Mayen. They can do it thanks to the Norwegian core on their capital, and it's by repeatedly fake releasing Norway that I've been able to keep my infamy down so far. In my old World Conquest video, I largely dismissed infamy as being of little concern in a world conquest, but that was colored by the fact that I had started the run as a great power that was strong enough to withstand containment wars pretty much from the get-go. The same cannot be said for Mayen, and had it not been for this exploit, the strategy I've used thus far in the run would likely never have worked. In fact, the realization that Mayen could make use of the fake release exploit was probably the biggest reason I even began contemplating a world conquest as them. That's not to say it would have been completely impossible otherwise, but you would have to play the early game a lot more carefully, and likely rely on a great deal of luck with infamy from war justifications. At this point in the run, I'd successfully acquired the means to raise a massive army, and I possessed a consistent means to keep my infamy in check. So does that mean I'm ready to start conquering the world for real? Not quite. There's still one essential ingredient I'm missing, and if you watched my old world conquest video, you'll know what that is. Revanchism. Revanchism is gained when other countries own provinces you have cores on. And the benefit of revanchism for our purposes is that it increases jingoism growth. Jingoism in turn is necessary for adding war goals during an ongoing war, something which is absolutely essential to a world conquest. Mayen starts the game with only a single core province, and that is their capital. In order to gain revanchism, I therefore had to find a way to gain additional cores and then find a way to lose control of them. Mayen does have a way to gain more cores, namely via the decision I mentioned near the beginning of the video, the Polar Bear Purchase, as that not only cedes Iceland and Greenland to you, but also gives you cores on the entire state. My original idea when planning this run was to take this decision at the earliest convenience, then deliberately lose a war against someone and have them either demand Iceland and Greenland for themselves, or demand I release Iceland as an independent nation, who would then take the rest of the state with them. This seemed like a great plan at first, but it had one fatal flaw. It relied on the AI to act in a way that makes sense. And the AI does not like acting in a way that makes sense. During my early test runs, I found that it's sometimes possible to get Sweden to demand the release of Iceland if you lose a war against them, but only if Iceland and Greenland is the only state you own besides your capital. If you've already conquered more territory than that, they seem more interested in demanding things like colonies. Or worst of all, they absolutely love adding a free people war goal to demand the release of Norway. Except Norway only has cores on my capital, and so even if that war goal is enforced, Norway won't get anything, making it effectively useless. So with that plan in the trash, that left me with only one other option. The generic coring event. This is an event unlocked by researching nationalism and imperialism, and it gives a chance for a great power to spawn a core in a province they own, provided that province either has a majority of their primary or accepted cultures, or is directly adjacent to an existing core province. In my old World Conquest video, I advised against researching nationalism and imperialism specifically to avoid this event, as it risks ruining your revanchism otherwise. But if you have no other way to gain revanchism in the first place, then you have nothing to lose really. Besides, I probably would have researched it in this run anyway, because when you have such a slow start as Mayen, you need every advantage you can get in order to catch up later, including the plus 10% war justification speed, the ability to use the established protectorate war goal against uncivs with more than one state, and the bonus to diplopoint generation provided by the next tech in that tech tree, revolution and counter-revolution. I knew that it was possible to research it without ruining your revanchism, because it had already been done by Dervis in their old Greek world conquest. I just have to be careful about migration and assimilation of accepted culture pops later on. With all this in mind, following my wars with China, my next target was none other than Sweden. By making sure a few of my armies became exiled at the end of my previous war, I could march them all the way to Europe unhindered. At this point I also entered into an alliance with Prussia and called them in to help. Aside from protection against containment wars, another big benefit of staying below the infamy limit is that it allows you to engage in diplomacy with other nations. This would mostly be helpful in the early game, where allies such as Prussia could make great power wars easier and more efficient at a time before my own army became truly dominant. Ideally, I would have preferred to ally a North German Federation rather than merely Prussia, but oh well, I'm sure they'll get around to forming it eventually. In preparation for this war, I began by justifying an acquire state war goal, but then I immediately followed it up by justifying a second war goal, dismantle fortifications. You'll see why in just a minute. When I got into position, I declared my war to annex the state of Vestlandet. As this was a Norwegian state, and Norwegian is my primary culture, all provinces there are eligible for the coring event. So the next step was to simply wait and hope to spawn at least one core, preferably before my second justified war goal expired. That's because my plan was to truce break Sweden as soon as possible, intentionally lose the war and allow them to reconquer the state. If I manage to gain cores in the state before then, they will then generate revanchism for me. The base mean time to happen for the coring event is 15 years, but that is cut in half if the province has a majority of your primary culture, and is further reduced if it's coastal and has low militancy. This was true for all 4 provinces in the state, so although not guaranteed, I stood a decent chance of triggering the event in at least one of them within the desired timeframe. In the end though, it went even better than expected, as I managed to get not just 1 but 2 cores in a short amount of time. In the short term this doesn't matter too much, as even a single core would have put my revanchism at 50%, which is way higher than the 20% required to get the maximum bonus to jingoism growth. But having an extra core means I can afford to get more random core spawns later before it starts to affect my jingoism. Anyway, once my second war against Sweden was well underway and they had begun to occupy Vestlandet, I did something which might seem a bit strange. I disbanded my entire army. Not just the ones near Sweden, but those back in China too. The reason for this is once again due to the AI being dumb, but at least in this case I know why they're being dumb and how to adapt to it. Apparently, an AI nation is only ever willing to add war goals in a war if their side is about equal or more powerful than the opposing side. If they're significantly weaker, they will never add any war goals, no matter how much war score they get, and even if that war goal is to reconquer a lost core. In other words, I have to delete most of my standing army before Sweden will even consider adding the war goal on me. This is quite annoying, but manageable. At least it seems that the Swedish AI will consistently demand their state back under these circumstances, unlike the mess with Iceland and Greenland I described earlier. When all was said and done, I now sat comfortably at 66% revanchism, giving me more than enough jingoism growth for the conquests that lay ahead. By the way, in case you're wondering how I was able to add so many war goals on Japan and China earlier despite not having any revanchism yet, for Japan the war simply took such a long time I was able to gain enough jingoism by the time it was done even without any additional bonuses. But for my first war with China I had to add my war goals in a much shorter time frame. Therefore I made sure to hold elections until I got one of the election events that grant bonus jingoism. One such event would be enough to add every war goal I wanted, since you actually lose less jingoism from adding war goals on uncivs compared to civilized countries. After the first war with China, I also got a huge boost in jingoism just from taking Chinese states, since China starts the game with a lot of revanchism themselves from all the cores they have on their substates, and so the Chinese population in those states had already built up a ton of jingoism by the time I conquered them. Thus, I needed no extra jingoism for my second war with China. Everything that's happened so far is what you might call the setup phase of the run, where the focus had been entirely on growing more powerful and gaining revanchism. The steps I've taken during this phase have been planned out in detail, and for the most part I didn't have to stray too far from that plan. As we now enter into the proper world conquest phase, while I still have some broad ideas for how I'll go about it, things will be getting too unpredictable to allow for planning at the same level of detail. One of these broad ideas is that I want to get started fighting the larger countries as soon as possible, since those will require the most amount of wars in total to finish off. I rebuilt my army over in East Asia and then used a combination of transport ships and exiled troops to get most of them moving toward Europe, but a few were sent on a detour through Egypt to conquer the state of Sinai from them. In general, I want to avoid taking lands from uncivs prior to the colonial scramble of the 1870s, since they come with a colonial maintenance cost. But I made an exception for Sinai, since owning it is a convenient way to facilitate troop transfers between Europe and Asia. And also, because if Egypt keeps it, there's a risk they'll get speared by another great power, who may then build a Suez Canal, annexing the province of Suez in the process. This would be wasteful, as it would add one additional war goal I'd have to take from that great power, so by taking Sinai for myself, I can prevent that. When it came to my first real war in Europe, I chose to attack Spain as my initial target, because they were allied to the UK. This would allow me to pre-position my exiled armies in the British Isles before the war, which is very convenient, since it can be tricky to invade Britain otherwise. Another advantage of this strategy is that if I place my exiled armies on top of the UK's standing armies when the war begins, the ensuing battles will count as defensive for me, potentially giving me the benefits of terrain and digging. As I was still allied to Prussia, I had called them in to help in this war, which was useful since while I was busy fighting in Britain, they could take care of Britain's allies on the continent. We were winning handily, and I certainly had the jingoism required to demand multiple war goals from each of my enemies, but I still settled for just one war goal from Spain and two from the UK. That's because I wasn't quite ready to exceed the infamy limit just yet, and even though the fake release exploit can burn an unlimited amount of infamy, it can only be used while at peace. Now, obviously, I couldn't keep restricting myself to only a couple of war goals per war if I was going to have a shot at a full world conquest by the end. But at this early stage of the run, I simply didn't have the military capacity to fight multiple containment wars simultaneously, without wasting a bunch of time. So my plan was to make sure I was either already at war or had truces with most of the stronger countries before I let myself exceed the infamy limit for the first time. This relatively quick war against the UK, Spain and Netherlands was the first step in that plan. The war goals I demanded in this war were Valencia from Spain, and from the UK I demanded their colonies in Lesser Antilles and the release of Canada as a one-state country in Newfoundland. That last one is both to set up for a liberation conquest of Canada later and to prevent the UK from releasing Canada as a dominion themselves. The UK has a lot of colonial points invested into Canada, and by preventing the release as a dominion, I can effectively reduce the amount of colonial points the UK has to spend on new colonies. I'll be doing the same thing for Australia, South Africa and India later. My next war target was Sardinia-Piedmont. They were chosen in part because they were allied to France, allowing me to set up the same type of exiled army ambush as I had done against the UK. This also let me get into war with France without simultaneously getting into war with their ally Russia. Later in the run, I would actually welcome the opportunity to fight two big countries like these in a single war, since that would save me the diplo points and justification time of having to declare war on them each separately. But at this early stage, I still lack the resources to efficiently fight both France and Russia at the same time, so it's preferable to split them up like this. Another reason to go for Sardinia-Piedmont as one of my first targets is to set up for yet another exploit, but that won't come to fruition for another few years, so I'll get back to that then. Something you'll notice from this war with France is that I kept switching over to the recruitment map mode every now and then. That's because this map mode shows which provinces act as mobilization centers for each state, i.e. the provinces where mobilized troops will spawn. By occupying these provinces ASAP, I'd be able to prevent most of my enemies' mobilized regiments from being raised. Or at least I'd be able to take advantageous defensive battles with them immediately as they appear. This is a technique I'll be using a lot throughout the run, since it can drastically reduce the time and effort required to win a war against a bigger country. Aside from the mobilization centers though, my main priority in these early wars is to fight and destroy my enemy's standing armies. Battle war score can rack up quite quickly until it reaches its cap at 50. But more importantly, it's very inefficient to try to occupy your enemy's lands while they still have a bunch of armies running around or taking anything you occupy. Once most of France was firmly under my boot, I began thinking about how to approach my next target in Europe, Russia. Russia is the country with the largest number of states that have to be taken individually, i.e. without the help of tricks such as Liberation-Conquest, so they're naturally a big priority. Now, if Prussia had managed to form NGF by this point, I could have just walked through their land to reach Russia. But as it stood, I was blocked off in the middle by some German miners who refused me military access. Instead, I had to once again exploit exiled armies. Some of my troops were exiled in Belgium by asking for and then cancelling military access, while others got exiled in Sardinia's other ally Modena, when I forced a white peace upon them. I moved my armies as close to Russia as I had time for before my war goal expired, then declared war. You may be wondering why I didn't end my war with France before starting up a new one against Russia. That's once again due to infamy. I didn't want to put off the beginning of proper conquesting any longer, so before ending my war with France, I wanted to add as many war goals on them as I could. If I did that before starting the war with Russia though, it's likely they would declare a containment war on me before I was in position to fight them, and on top of that, Prussia would refuse my call to arms. While not essential, Prussia's assistance in these early wars would still be very helpful, so I wanted to ensure they joined in before I exceeded the infamy limit. Early wars with Russia require a slightly different approach from what we've seen before. They're far too large to efficiently lock down all their mobilization centers, and rather than focusing on destroying all their standing armies, you actually want to avoid battles with them as much as you can. That's because Russia is notoriously unstable, and if you beat down their military too hard, there's a good chance all the nations that have cores on their Eastern European territories will either rise up as separatist rebels or trigger a crisis for the release of their respective nations. These nations receiving independence is not in your best interest, since most of them have cores on territories that could otherwise be acquired as part of a liberation conquest of Poland-Lithuania later on. As such, in wars against Russia, I am mostly focused on occupying my war goals and relying on ticking war score from those to bring me victory. Doing this while avoiding battles required a lot of annoying trading of occupations back and forth, but in the long term it would be worth it. Speaking of running back and forth, you may have noticed that oftentimes when I order an army to move from one province to another within hostile territory, I will split off one cavalry unit and let them run ahead of the rest of the army. The reason for this is actually attrition management. In Victoria 2, attrition damage is applied not only at the end of each month, but also when an army first arrives in a new province. Attrition damage is dependent on the supply limit in a province, and supply limit is lower in enemy province compared to provinces you control. But interestingly, as soon as you begin occupying an enemy province, it counts as being under your control as far as supply limit is concerned. So, if an army is about to arrive in a province whose supply limit is too low to support that army, you can reduce the attrition suffered upon entry by first sending a smaller stack ahead by at least one day so that they begin occupying the province. Hence, when the larger stack arrives, the supply limit will be effectively doubled compared to normal. Using cavalry units for this is convenient, since they're faster than most other unit types and will thus typically arrive first without requiring any more microing. I did this a lot in the early to mid-game, when supply was lower and my army reserves were more limited. But as I get further into the game, I didn't bother with it as much. While all this was happening in Europe, on the other side of the globe, I was putting together a few new armies and sent them on ships across the Pacific to the west coast of the USA. The USA is also one of the bigger countries, and so I wanted to get started on them early. Luckily, their population isn't that big in the beginning, so I didn't need more than a few armies to deal with them. This marked the first instance of multi-continent warfare of the campaign, something of a necessary evil when doing a world conquest, as microing armies all across the globe simultaneously can become quite tedious. But you might as well get used to it now, because let me tell you, it's only going to get worse. In any case, not long after starting this latest batch of wars, I made a separate peace with Sardinia-Piedmont, annexing everything they owned save for their capital. This meant they were ready to be fully annexed the next time I'd fight them. Eventually, I managed to achieve a decisive victory against Russia, and not long thereafter I also made peace with France, having finally added all the war goals I wanted against them. When looking at the states I annexed, you may notice a pattern. They're all coastal, and in the case of France, a bunch of them are also colonies. Prior to colonization, I want to focus mostly on taking coastal states, to get more naval bases so I can build more ships to generate colonial power for me, and also to rob my colonial competitors of their own naval bases. When it comes to colonies, I actually would like to avoid them at this stage of the game, since they come with a colonial maintenance cost, much like uncivilized land. But it's useful to take smaller colonies to get more colonial reach for myself and to deny colonial reach to my competitors. Not long after making peace with Russia, I had my first containment war declared on me by Austria, as I now shared a border with them. Since I had truces with almost every other powerful European nation, except Prussia who was my ally, Austria was pretty much the only one remaining who would dare pull this sort of thing on me. It did not end well for them. But even though I probably could have forced an unconditional surrender on them if I had committed to it, I instead let them off the hook with a white peace as soon as they agreed to it. That's because I have much more ambitious plans for them down the road. But I'll talk about that when we get there. Around this time I also declared war on Persia. Persia is a bit of an awkward case to deal with, because on the one hand I prefer to hold off on conquering them until after colonization is finished, to save on colonial maintenance. But on the other hand, they're one of the uncivs that can westernize the fastest, and will almost always do so long before the colonial scramble if left to their own devices. Once they westernize, they will be much slower to conquer than before, since states belonging to uncivs are generally cheaper war score-wise than their civilized counterparts, and uncivs can also be fully annexed once they're down to 4 states, compared to civilized countries that must be down to a single state. In an attempt to reconcile these contradictory interests, I declared this war primarily to try to force reactionary rebels to rise up in Persia and break the country. When an unciv falls to reactionary rebels, they are forced to roll back a few of their reforms, which loses them some westernization progress. Persia did get a few reactionary rebels during the war, and the safest way to ensure they would succeed would have been to prolong the war until they had occupied Persia's capital. However, I was getting to a point where I really needed some time at peace again, for 2 reasons. One was to get a chance to use the fake release exploit to burn the rather substantial amount of infamy I had acquired during these latest wars, and the other was to burn war exhaustion. War exhaustion is gained when non-colonial provinces in your home continent get either occupied or blockaded by your enemies in war, and also in one other circumstance, which is the weirdest shit ever, but we'll get to that later. It comes with several negative effects that get worse the more war exhaustion you accumulate. But for a world conquest, the worst of these is the penalty to war justification time. War justifications are one of the main bottlenecks for any world conquest run, so you want to avoid these penalties as much as you can. I had accrued a decent amount of war exhaustion the past few years due to blockades of my home island, and by now it was getting too high for comfort. Among the few consistent ways to reduce war exhaustion is to be at peace, which makes you burn 1 war exhaustion per month. I couldn't wait to declare my next batch of wars for much longer, so if I was going to have time to burn some war exhaustion, I would need to end all my current wars ASAP. Hence, I had to peace out Persia and just pray that the rebels could manage on their own. I did take their 2 coastal states just because it felt wasteful to fight an entire war without gaining any new territory, but no more than that. Sadly, as it would turn out, the Persian rebels did not manage on their own, and so the threat of a westernized Persia remained for the time being. I also made peace with the USA, where I took the state of New England on the east coast and the majority of their western territories that were still colonies. That might seem a bit strange. Earlier I said I primarily wanted to take coastal states, and only take colonies if they could help me gain more colonial range. But most of what I took from the US here were inland colonies, which flies completely in the face of all that. That's because there are a few more considerations I have to make. Colonies with a low population, particularly in the New World, tend to get turned into full states before long. Full states cost more war score to demand in a peace deal than colonies, so it's preferable to grab them before that happens. This is especially important for a nation with a lot of big colonies like the US, where we're likely to cut down the total number of wars needed to annex them a great deal this way. There is also another reason for this, which is arguably even more important, but we'll talk about that later. After making peace, I could then proceed to click the Release Norway button about 30 times in a row, to convince the world that I'm actually a really nice guy after all. Then I had a few months to spend at peace to burn war exhaustion before my next war goal was due. This one was directed at Portugal, in large part because they were allied to the UK, and so I could get into war with the latter even before our truce was up. Another exiled army's ambush made short work of the British Isles, and exiled armies also allowed me to send troops to both Portugal's homeland and their colonies in Africa. It didn't take me long to decisively defeat both the UK and Portugal, but I still had to drag the war out for the sake of adding all the war goals I wanted. Against opponents with a lot of chief colonies, the main bottleneck for finishing a war tends not to be the time it takes to actually defeat them, but the time spent waiting to regain jingoism and diplo points in between adding each batch of war goals. This will only become more true as the game goes on and the power disparity between myself and my enemies grow ever larger. But even after I had added all the war goals I needed, I still dragged the wars out for a while longer. In this case, it was to preserve diplo points. Normally, when you send a peace offer, you lose 1 diplo point. But if your opponent sends you a peace offer, accepting it costs no diplo points. Additionally, if you manage to reach 100 war score and force your enemy into an unconditional surrender, that doesn't cost any diplo points either. Since the UK was the war leader, Portugal would not send me any separate peace offers of their own, so I had to keep occupying things until I reached 100 war score before I could peace them out. With Portugal out, however, the UK soon sent me a peace offer, letting me end it with them without needing the full 100 war score. I ended up taking a bunch of colonies and a few home states from both of them, but I also forced the release of South Africa and Australia as one-state minors from the UK, and released India from Portugal's province of Goa. In all cases, it's for the sake of setting up liberation conquests down the line, as well as preventing the UK from releasing them as dominions. Now at peace, I once again used a fake release exploit to eliminate my infamy, and that then enabled me to make use of one of the other major benefits of keeping below the infamy limit, the Geneva Convention decision. This decision is somewhat infamous, no pun intended, for being quite bad in a regular playthrough, as although it reduces your infamy by 1 when you take it, it then also imposes a 0.01 monthly infamy growth modifier. So long term it'll generate a lot more infamy than it reduces, which tends to overshadow the other benefits the decision brings. But in a world conquest, infamy doesn't matter in the long term. On the other hand, Among the benefits of the decision is a 0.02 monthly war exhaustion reduction modifier, which might not sound like much, but is in fact a pretty big deal. War exhaustion is one of the biggest threats to a world conquest run, and this modifier not only reduces it by quite a lot over time, but also lets you reduce it while at war. The only problem is that you can't take the decision if you are currently above the infamy limit. And in a world conquest run, you'll definitely be way above that limit by the time the decision becomes available. Unless you have access to the fake release exploit, that is. Naturally, I did not hesitate to sign the Geneva Convention as soon as I could, because if there's one thing I'm known for, it's my respect for international law. There is one more benefit to being able to stay below the infamy limit that we can also observe here, and somewhat counterintuitively, it's the ability to damage relations with other countries without wasting diplo points. If your relations with another country is above 100, you can't justify war goals on them. But normally you'd need to waste diplo points in order to lower relations. However, if the other country sends you a diplomatic proposal, such as an alliance offer, you can reject it for free, which in turn sours your mutual relations. The AI will rarely send you diplomatic proposals if you're above the infamy limit, but now that I was below the limit, I kept getting alliance proposals sent to me from a bunch of different countries, allowing me to reject or ignore them until our relations had dropped as low as I needed them. Anyway, just when the UK thought they were out, I pulled them back in by declaring war on their ally Spain, which also dragged in the Netherlands again. In this war you can see examples of reinforcement management, as I sometimes make armies wait to move into enemy territory to make sure they arrive on the 2nd of the following month at the earliest. Armies reinforce a lot quicker in territory you own or control, and reinforcements always happen on the 1st of each month. But if an army is moving into another province on the 1st, the movement is calculated before the reinforcements. To maximize reinforcements, it's therefore better to have them wait an extra day if the province they're moving into is enemy controlled, or if they would enter a battle upon arrival, since reinforcements don't happen at all during battles. Some time later I got another chance to fight a war with France, as my truce with Sardinia-Piedmont had run out, allowing me to declare war on them and drag France in along with their other ally, the Papal States. I eventually got to a point where I had decisively defeated them and added all the war goals I wanted, but I didn't immediately sue for peace. That's because there was something I needed to wait for first, which we'll see in a little bit. In the meantime, I made peace with Spain and took 2 states and 2 colonies from them. Ideally, I would have liked to take the state of Andalusia instead of Galicia, so I could keep my land more connected. But in a world conquest, you don't always have the luxury to choose exactly what you want to take, and must instead go for whatever your available war score will allow. I didn't get the chance to peace out anyone else before I had to start yet another major war, this time against Russia. Fighting one war at a time is another luxury you rarely have in a world conquest. Thanks to the land I had already taken from Russia before, I was in a position where I could at least try to seal off some of their mobilization centers at the start of the war, but the sheer vastness of their empire makes it impossible to stop them from raising a very sizable army nonetheless. Around this time I also discovered a very important invention: monitors. As you may recall from my old World Conquest video, when it comes to colonization, the most efficient ship for generating colonial points is the ironclad. I had already invented ironclads by this point, but the problem with them is that they can only be built in level 3 naval bases that are connected to your capital over land. Seeing as my capital is an isolated island, that means I can only build ironclads there, except under certain specific circumstances that are weird as hell, but I'll talk about that later. But the second most efficient ship type is the monitor, and they can be built in any level 3 naval base, regardless of capital connection. So in this run I'll have to rely mostly on monitors for colonial power. This is especially true since colonial power gained from the naval bases themselves is dependent on the same type of capital connection as the ironclads. Thus I won't be getting much colonial power that way either, except yet again under certain specific circumstances, but I'll talk about that later too. Throughout the game I'd been building naval bases in every coastal state I could get my hands on, And now that I've unlocked monitors, it's time to start mass producing them. The next country I made peace with was the Netherlands, taking one of their home states and a whole bunch of colonies. This also finally freed me to make peace with their war leader Britain, where aside from more colonies, I also took all of Scotland and one state in Ireland. I specifically went for these to try to prevent Scottish or Irish nationalists from breaking free from the UK. Generally speaking, it's more efficient to conquer territory from larger nations directly than having to declare separate wars on any potential breakaway states. But as one war ends, another must begin, and so I declared my second war against Persia. Like I said earlier, my hopes that they would fall to reactionary rebels had failed. But despite that, they still hadn't managed to westernize by the time our truce ran out, so back in I went for a second try. I also declared my second war against the USA around this time. During that war, I had my first nationalist uprising, in New England of all places. In some ways, nationalist rebels are the most dangerous kind, since if they occupy all the core provinces of the nation, they'll become independent, whereas most other rebels only change their government form. But in other ways, they are the least troublesome, since their uprisings tend to be relatively small in both numbers and scope, whereas other types of rebellions have no limit to how big or widespread they can get. Nonetheless, when nationalists do rise up, you should make it a priority to put them down as soon as you can, so they don't get a chance to secede. After being at war for nearly 5 years straight, I was soon ready to wrap things up with France. So I double-checked my war goals, annexed Italy, and then sent the final peace offer. Wait, what? Okay, let's rewind a bit. Remember earlier how I said I couldn't make peace in the French War because there was something I needed to wait for? Well, that something was Garibaldi redshirt rebels. These are a special flavor of pan-nationalists that may rise up in any Italian country, and if they enforce their demands there, they may cause Italy to form and unite the peninsula. Any Italian country that is a great power has a chance to become Italy this way, but Sardinia-Piedmont has the unique advantage in that they can form Italy even if they aren't a great power. This fact enables an exploit I tend to call the Unification-Conquest exploit. It has the same basic idea as the similarly named Liberation-Conquest exploit, namely, declare a conquest war on a small country and then make it grow to a larger size before annexing it. But rather than accomplishing this through the Liberate Country war goal, you accomplish it by letting the target country form a new nation and integrate a bunch of additional territory in the process. In most cases, a country has to be a great power to form a new nation, but to be a great power, you need at least 2 states, which is one too many for adding the conquest war goal. But thanks to Sardinia-Piedmont's special exception, it's possible to reduce them down to a single state, add a conquest war goal, and then let them form Italy. Despite being an entirely new tag, the war goal remains valid, so you can annex them in one go. This had been my plan ever since my first war with Sardinia, and in fact it worked out even better than expected, thanks to Sardinia's alliance with the Papal States. To make Garibaldi redshirts appear, you typically have to declare a separate war on another Italian country, such as Two Sicilies, which will cost you both diplo points and justification time. But since Papal States joined against me when I attacked Sardinia-Piedmont, I could occupy them and cause redshirt rebels to spawn without requiring an extra war. Overall, annexing Italy this way is a lot more efficient than picking off each Italian minor separately. The only downside is that rebels can be unpredictable, and so any strategy that relies on them becomes unpredictable as well. In this case it worked out without much issue, but as we shall see later, it doesn't always go as smoothly. From France I took the typical combination of coastal states and colonies, but I also let Prussia conquer Alsace-Lorraine from them, as I want Germany to be able to form down the line. It's nice that they added the war goal on their own accord like that. I'm sure they'll be happy to do similar things in the future as well. Not long thereafter I made peace with Russia, where I focused on gobbling up as many colonies as I could, in addition to a few more states. One of these states was Okhotsk, all the way over in eastern Siberia, which I took in order to gain access to the uncolonized land in the north. But Okhotsk only gives direct access to a small part of this land, So why not take some more Siberian states so I can reach all of it? And for that matter, if I'm really prioritizing coastal states as I claim, why were two of the states I annexed in this war landlocked, even though Russia has plenty of coastal states left to choose from? Weird, huh? I soon made peace with the US and focused primarily on taking states off the east coast. But I also made sure to take Hawaii, which the US had annexed through event earlier. This would extend my colonial reach in the Pacific while cutting off the US from the same. I also annexed Liberia in the same war. They start as a puppet of the US but can gain independence via a decision later, which they had done by this point. I also decided to annex Persia's ally Bukhara. This would tie up some colonial maintenance for me, but in the long run it would potentially save me diplo points and justification time from not needing a separate war to conquer them, so I deemed it worth it. I might have done the same to Persia's other ally Punjab too, but unfortunately I didn't have any good way to reach them at the moment. As for Persia itself, I had kept them under full occupation for a while, and they had some rather large rebel stacks close to their capital. As I was keen to have some time at peace again, I decided to peace them out and only took one additional state from them, namely Tabriz. This turned out to be a mistake. Most of the Persian rebels had spawned in Tabriz, so when I annexed it, those rebels instantly disappeared. Still, rebels in general have a higher chance to rise up when a country is at peace, so I had hoped that ending the war with Persia would inspire new rebels to rise up there. Unfortunately, not enough of them did, and so Persia ended up becoming civilized anyway. This was the second major mistake of the run. I wasted 2 wars trying in vain to slow down Persia's westernization, but since I failed, they would now require many more wars to fully annex. At least I was at peace again, so I could burn my infamy, which would be necessary to re-establish my alliance with Prussia. Earlier in the video, I've noted that Prussia still hasn't formed the North German Federation, and that I'd really like them to do that. This is not merely to get a stronger ally, but is actually an important step toward my ultimate plans for conquering Germany and Central Europe. The idea is this: get Prussia to form the NGF, then beat the shit out of them, and also Austria, so they drop from great power, while allowing Bavaria to rise to that status instead. Then just keep sitting on NGF and Austria until Bavaria gets round to spearing them, along with the other South German minors, which will allow them to form Super Germany. Once that happens, you can perform liberation conquests to annex all the territory of both NGF and Austria, dramatically reducing the number of wars required to conquer the region. It's important that Bavaria is the one to actually form Germany, because if, for example, NGF were to do it, we would not be able to liberate their cores for war. But of course, this plan hinges on Prussia actually forming the North German Federation. Now, usually this isn't a problem, as they only need to add a handful of territories to the sphere to fulfill the requirements. But the Austrian AI has an annoying tendency to declare war on Denmark to liberate Schleswig from them. And if this happens before Prussia has managed to spare Denmark, there's a very good chance it will completely derail their attempts at forming the NGF. That is exactly what happened in this campaign. You'd think all Prussia would have to do is to refocus their efforts from sparing Denmark to sparing Schleswig. But instead of doing that, they ended up just wasting their influence on God knows what and never getting any closer to their objective. The worst part is, this isn't even the first time this has happened to me. During my original John Mayen world conquest attempt, the exact same thing occurred, and while it wasn't the primary reason I abandoned that attempt, it definitely contributed to that decision. In hindsight, I probably should have been more patient in the beginning and just kept restarting the run until the NGF managed to form by around 1850, as you would expect them to do. But I had already been forced to restart so many times for other reasons that I decided to keep going and just hope Prussia will get their shit together eventually. Sadly, they did not. So finally, I decided to take a more proactive approach to help them along, by declaring war on Denmark, who at this point had reconquered Schleswig, and called Prussia in. Since Prussia had researched nationalism and imperialism, they had a free war goal to annex Schleswig outright, and the plan was to let them get some war score so they could add that war goal. Once they had acquired Schleswig, they would fulfill all the requirements to form the North German Federation. So I did just that. We easily crushed their opposition, Prussia was allowed to occupy the state of Schleswig, and they didn't add the war goal. They just didn't. The free war goal, which would cost them no infamy to add, which would give them the final piece of the puzzle to allow them to form the NGF, they just didn't add it. I let the war drag on for years. It didn't matter. And it's not like there isn't a precedent for this, because only a few years earlier, Prussia was happy to add the exact same war goal against France to conquer Alsace-Lorraine. So I know they can do it, but they just refused. This fucking AI is killing me. Phew. Anyway, these problems with Prussia were the third major thing that went wrong this campaign. Fortunately, I did have a backup plan, though that would come with its own problems. More on that later. While this was going on, I also declared war on Austria, originally with the intent of just fully occupying them and keeping them that way until Germany could form. But since Prussia decided to suck, I eventually ended up just releasing Hungary as a single state instead. This was necessary as part of my backup plan. However, all that was several years in the future from where we are now. In the meantime, I declared my first war on the Ottomans, who much like Russia must be treated with care lest they implode into a heap of upstart minorities. As a standard procedure, I focused on coastal states, but I made sure to avoid any states that can be acquired for liberation conquest later, of which there are several that can be used on the Ottomans. I also went for a few select states in the east to connect my lands in Persia to my lands in Russia. Since France kept having rebellions that eliminated my truces with them, I could attack them next and made sure to tie together some more disconnected pieces of land, but intentionally left a gap in the Pyrenees to allow exiled troops to move through without getting unexiled, just in case I'd want to make use of that in the future. During that war, I happened to look over to the USA and whoa! That's a pretty big confederacy, huh? This caught me a bit off guard, since I assumed by now that the American Civil War was either not going to trigger, or that it already had triggered and resolved itself without me noticing somehow. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it though. During my Germany world conquest a few years ago, I had intentionally helped the CSA win, since I thought it might be to my advantage to split the American land between two different tags to provide more flexibility with truce timers. But in the end, it had just created a big mess, and so I wasn't sure I wanted to encourage it in this campaign. But lo and behold, for what I think is the first time ever in one of my games, the CSA actually survived on their own without any direct intervention from me. I mean, my repeated bludgeoning of the US prior to this probably had something to do with it, but still. And now that they were here to stay, it made me consider a strategy I had contemplated for a while, and it's one which would take advantage of the very same mechanics that made such a mess of North America in my Germany world conquest. But more on that later. Oh, but will you look at the date? It's 1870. You know what that means. It's time to set in motion a horrible system of exploitation whose aftermath continues to perpetuate the conditions for ethnic conflict and socio-economic inequality to this day, also known as the Scramble for Africa. This is what most of my conquest strategies so far in the game have been leading up to, and to make the most out of it, I made sure to save up research points in the year prior so that I could research machine guns as quickly as possible. Machine guns is one of the technologies that allows the invention of colonial negotiations, which in turn provides the final bit of minimum life rating needed to grab all the uncolonized land that remains. I took the opportunity to get into war with Spain and the UK around this time as well, with the intention of keeping the UK at war until colonization had finished. The UK was my biggest colonial rival, and although I had made sure to prevent the release of their largest dominions, they still had some smaller ones available which they'd be likely to release eventually to free up colonial points. I didn't want that to happen, mostly because that would create new countries I'd have to conquer in separate wars, and several releasable dominions also overlap with Canadian core provinces, which would be especially wasteful since I'd get those lands for free in a liberation conquest anyway. But since you can't release dominions while at war, I could guarantee that wouldn't happen by prolonging the latest war until there'd be nothing left in reach for the British to colonize. Aside from Persia, the one other unciv that is at risk of westernizing before colonization is complete is Japan. I had expected I might have to try to force reactionary rebels in them as well, but for whatever reason they hadn't made nearly as much progress toward westernizing as Persia, and since I had already conquered half of them earlier, I only needed one more war to finish them off. But now that colonization was underway and Japan was getting dangerously close to 100% westernization progress, I decided to at least start a war to annex them now, so that I could finish it as soon as it was feasible to do so. I also attacked Russia again, seeing as they could potentially become an obstacle to my colonization of northern Siberia. I was juggling quite a few wars by now, but as colonization progressed and I became more confident I could secure everything even if I annexed some more colonial land, I could gradually end them one by one. I made a rather amusing discovery that I'd done such a good job neutralizing my colonial competitors that the only ones who remained to challenge me were the United Kingdom and Denmark. Partially due to this, and partially because I had finally given up on Russia's ability to be useful, I ended my war with Denmark and among other things stole their little foothold in Ghana, which had enabled their colonial aspirations thus far. Japan had been annexed some time earlier, and some time later I made peace with Spain and their ally Netherlands for some of their stuff in Southeast Asia. These territories would incur some colonial maintenance cost, but given how much colonial power I had to spare at this point, it's not like I was suddenly going to run out or anything. Oh. Now hold on a minute. You mean to tell me a few Asian colonies increased colonial maintenance by more than 1700? Well, no, they didn't. The sudden drop in colonial power was related to these peace treaties, but not because of the territories that were ceded. Remember back when I explained how ironclads could only be built in naval bases connected to your capital, and that only such naval bases provided any direct colonial power. And remember how I hinted at there being certain specific circumstances where this didn't hold true, but refused to elaborate further? Well, I'm about to elaborate further. I don't fully understand the mechanics behind this, but for some reason, if your capital is in an isolated position, such as Mayen, and an enemy either blockades it or has armies in the process of occupying it, the game apparently assigns some other province you own to act as your capital for certain functions. One of these functions is for determining whether a naval base has a land connection to your capital. In other words, if at any time a capital is being blockaded or occupied, the game treats one of my provinces in continental Europe as a sort of pseudo-capital instead, and so any naval base connected to that province suddenly begins generating colonial power, and allows for the construction of ironclads. What happened just now is that during my war with Spain, they landed a small army on Mayen and began occupying it, which immediately gave me a big boost to my colonial power by reassigning my capital to be somewhere in Western Europe, and also allowed me to begin constructing ironclads in many more naval bases than I could before. When the war ended, that bonus immediately went away, but at least the ironclads I had begun constructing were allowed to finish. This game is so fucking weird. My general strategy for colonization was to keep the British occupied in a couple of places while I tried to grab the rest of the African coast and the islands of the Pacific as soon as possible. Once all of that was secured, I could safely leave the interior of Africa be for the time being, while I focused on outcompeting the UK in the few territories where they were still contesting me. Despite losing the big bonus from Spain's occupation of my capital, I managed to gradually squeeze out more colonial power from building ships. Due to a shortage of goods, I eventually had to lower my naval maintenance and even my army maintenance temporarily, in order to free up more goods for the construction of new ships. But in the end it proved enough to resolve every colonial dispute in my favor. Once I had expelled the British from the lost region they could reach to colonize, I could finally end my war with them. One of the demands I made was to return Belize to the USAA, who has cores there. Now, why did I do that rather than just taking it for myself? Weird, huh? Soon thereafter, I made peace with Russia, and one notable state I demanded was Lower Yenisei, since that gave me access to the last bit of uncolonized land in northern Russia. As colonization was starting to wrap up, I was free to begin conquering uncivs, and I generally tried to prioritize those uncivs that had more than one state first, since I'd have the most to lose by letting them westernize. I had already taken one state from Sokoto earlier to bring them below the annexation threshold, and now I did the same to Siam, before mopping up some of China's former substates, many of which had conveniently allied with each other. After annexing Yunnan, Qinghai, Xinjiang, and finally Guangxi, I was once again at peace after spending the better part of a decade at war. As always, I took that opportunity to remove my infamy and burn some war exhaustion, before gearing up for the next war against the USA. That war was eventually declared on the 16th of April 1875, and I'm specifically mentioning that because, while I didn't know it at the time, this would mark the last time I'd be at peace for the entire rest of the campaign. I should note that the American Civil War was still going on at this point, and seemed to have reached something of a stalemate, but as I said earlier, it eventually ended with the CSA preserving their independence. I took a couple of states from the US, somewhat weighted toward forming a land bridge to connect my western and eastern territories. The US was allied to both the USCA and their breakaway state Costa Rica, but I didn't take any territory from them, even though it is usually a good idea to conquer things from the allies of your primary target, so as to reduce the total number of wars you have to fight. So why didn't I do that this time? Weird, huh? Before ending that war, I had already declared war on both Russia and Persia, and the Russian war would drag on long enough for me to start the next batch of wars. Chaining wars like this is one of the reasons I never got a chance to be at peace again before the end of the game. All those ships I'd been mass producing for the sake of colonial power, combined with all the new armies I was able to build in both Africa and Asia, meant I was starting to experience my first major shortage of military goods, mostly canned food. This was a problem in my old Germany world conquest too, and I think it can easily happen when you're too focused on wars and neglect your industry, combined with repeatedly occupying all the other industrialized nations of the world. Every now and then I try to go around building and expanding military factories, but overall it was tricky to keep up with demand, and I actually ended up disbanding large portions of my navy later on, since it was ridiculously oversized once colonization was done. Speaking of which, it took me all the way until the year 1880 to acquire the final piece of uncolonized land, since after I had secured all the territories that other nations could potentially snag, there wasn't a great hurry in getting the rest, just as long as they got around to it eventually. The last state I colonized was up in northern Canada, which I could safely leave for last, since the AI will never attempt to colonize a state that another existing nation has cores on, in this case Canada. After annexing some of their former substates, it was time to return to China itself. I made sure to reduce them down to 4 states, so that I could fully annex them next time. Shortly thereafter, I got my first taste of something that would continue to be an annoyance throughout the game. Crisis releasing or returning land to smaller nations within regions that I would otherwise have been able to acquire for free via liberation conquest. In this case, it was Romania being released from Austria. Most of the time I had no way to prevent these crises because I happened to be at war when they fired. This one I actually had a chance to intervene in, as it fired during my latest window of peace. I still chose not to, however, because while you're involved in a crisis, all your war justifications are paused, and I also wasn't confident I had become powerful enough yet to persuade the other side to surrender before it escalated into a war. Crisis wars are very inefficient, since you can't make separate peace during them, so they only tend to lead to truces with multiple great powers without being able to conquer all that much from them. I was hoping Austria's side of the crisis would be able to win on their own, but alas, it was not to be. The latest war against Russia had been going on for quite some time, because even after I had reached 100 war score and added all the war goals I wanted, I kept dragging it out to allow Russian rebels to get close to breaking the country. I decided it was about time I tried to force rebellions in the bigger countries to make sure truce timers don't become a problem later, and this allowed me to declare several successive wars against both Russia and the USA around this time. During these wars against Russia, I had a particular focus on a certain set of states. At the start of the game, there are multiple states that are split between a Russian-controlled part and an uncolonized part, and a few that are split between a Russian-controlled part and a part controlled by one of the uncivs in Central Asia. In both cases, the Russian-controlled part is a full state, while the other part is a colonial territory. Earlier in the run, I had already either conquered or colonized the colonial parts of these states, and in these most recent wars, I finally conquered the Russian halves as well. I deliberately made sure to acquire the colonial parts before the full state parts, due to an odd inconsistency in the game. For some reason, when a state is split this way and you acquire the full state part before the colonial part, they will remain split and effectively be treated as two separate territories. But if you acquire the colonial part before the full state part, they will merge together into a single colonial territory. As such, by conquering them in this order, I could effectively turn all these Russian states into colonies. But why would I want to turn Russian states into colonies? Weird, huh? Parallel to this, I fought wars against the Ottomans and Mongolia, which were pretty unremarkable, all things considered. And to be honest, most wars going forward are going to be similarly unremarkable. So I might be getting to a point in the video where I'll stop mentioning every single war I fight and only focus on the more interesting cases. Lord knows this video is going to be long enough as it is. Speaking of more interesting cases, it's time to put that backup plan to my Germany conquest strategy into motion. Or at least attempt to. Since Prussia failed to form the North German Federation, I couldn't rely on Germany forming the normal way. At least not by Bavaria, who is the one I need to do it. But as you probably know, there is another way. German pan-nationalists. To make this happen, all I'd have to do is make sure Prussia and Austria stop being great powers, while ensuring Bavaria starts being one. Then get German pan-nationalists to rise up and enforce demands in any German minor, and voila! We'll have a Bavaria-formed Super Germany to dismember. Sounds simple, right? Unfortunately, there are some caveats. First is the fact that Austria can only become integrated into a Germany formed this way if Hungary exists as an independent nation. But that had already been taken care of earlier. The second, much more problematic caveat is that getting German pan-nationalists to spawn and enforce their demands is notoriously unreliable. Unlike most other rebel types, pan-nationalists typically can't spawn in a country that is at war. I say typically because there definitely are cases where I've seen them spawn during a war, but I don't know exactly why. I think it might be that if a pan-nationalist rebel movement already exists in the country and has regiments ready to rise up, then they may rise up even during war. But if the movement doesn't already exist when the war starts, then it can't appear after. Maybe. Honestly, I've been reading through the game files, experimented in-game, and even asked around on modding forums in an attempt to find a clear answer to how these freaking rebels work, but I'm still confused about it. Either way, the standard rebel-provoking method of fully occupying a country and just waiting for the rebels to pop up usually doesn't work with pan-nationalists. Which is a shame, because if they were to rise up while they're not at war with their country of origin, then you can't stop that country from killing the rebels with their own armies. Nevertheless, I gave it a shot by declaring war on Prussia, which got most German miners dragged in as well. But I soon realized that Prussia had too much prestige to reliably keep them below great power rank, even after eliminating their army and industry. So eventually I opted to make peace with them by enforcing a humiliate war goal. That way their prestige would be significantly lowered, so after a truce was up, I could occupy them again, and hopefully that would be enough. Austria didn't have as much prestige to begin with though, so I could begin occupying them now and just keep that war going until I was ready to drop Prussia too. By the way, you know what's fun? Trying to ensure you manage to occupy every single province of a country when your map colors are almost identical. What's even more fun is noticing you're gaining war exhaustion from enemy occupations, but can't for the life of you see that any of your home provinces are occupied. Until you finally notice the fairly distinguishable white occupation lines over your white provinces. God, I wish they had been able to form Austria-Hungary by now. In any case, I would have to put off conquering Germany for a bit longer, but I still had plenty of time left in the game, so I decided to be patient for now. Next up, it was time to conquer all of India. This would be my first use of the Liberation-Conquest exploit of the run, with the idea being to liberate all cores of India from the UK, while simultaneously declaring war to annex the tiny India I had released from Portugal earlier. But this would only account for the Indian territory under direct British control. The territory owned by UK's Indian puppets would require a different method, namely the same one I had planned to use to conquer China's substates before I screwed that up. I fully occupied both the UK itself and their puppets, and then waited for rebels to either break the UK or to break each puppet individually. Once the puppets became independent this way, I could add conquest war goals and piece them out separately. This war took a very long time to complete, partially because I had to wait for rebels to do their thing, but mostly because of the greatest diplo point shortage I experienced in the entire run. Turns out, when you need to spend diplo points to add individual conquest war goals on roughly 15 Indian miners, and add multiple war goals on each of the UK's other allies like Spain, Portugal and Greece, and add war goals in multiple parallel wars against among others Russia and the USA, the 0.7 diplo points you gain per month is going to have trouble keeping up with the amount. Around this time I had what I think was my first major rebellion of the run, or at least the first one since conquering most of China. Rebels are always a nuisance in this game, but they tend to get significantly worse after conquering China, due to the sheer amount of people living there. At this point they were still manageable though, thanks to being able to pass reforms. Speaking of rebels, after forcing yet another rebellion in Russia, they turned into the Soviet Union. I was preparing to take advantage of the truce removal by justifying yet another war on them, but before I could do that, a crisis fired for the liberation of Poland from Russia, and it resolved in Poland's favor almost immediately. This was the fourth big setback of the run, since it removed a lot of land I could have gotten for free via liberation conquest of Poland-Lithuania. It made me realize I had been too reckless with completely crushing Russia and forcing rebellions before I had done the liberation conquest. Like I said earlier in the video, I needed to be careful with Russia since they have a tendency to implode in precisely this fashion, but it seems I had failed to heed my own advice. This was a big enough problem that after I made another smaller mistake too, I decided to reload an earlier save in an attempt to prevent these issues. This would be my first, but unfortunately not my last, save scum of the run. Ironically, it didn't matter though, as the crisis was apparently already lined up to trigger, and so the exact same thing happened again. If I wanted to prevent it, I would have had to go back much further, something I wasn't willing to do, so in the end I simply had to accept this setback. In my following war with the Soviets, I decided to set up for the liberation conquest anyway, by releasing Poland-Lithuania as a single state country. Although the exploit would be much less efficient now, it would still be better than conquering those states individually. Sadly, the game wasn't done screwing with my plans, as sometime later the Soviets got hit by several different nationalist uprisings at once. One of them, the Belarusian one, actually succeeded, removing yet another state I otherwise would have gotten for free. Once my truce with Prussia was up, I declared war on them yet again, and this time their prestige was low enough that a full occupation and destruction of their army made them drop from great power. Now all I had to do was keep occupying both them and Austria and hope that some German pan-nationalist would manage to enforce demands in any of the German states. Meanwhile, I had to regularly fight off Prussia and Austria's own rebellions, because otherwise I'd lose my occupations and possibly allow them to start rebuilding armies. Beating down rebellions in other countries is even more annoying than in your own country, since you don't get notifications when they appear, nor can you make use of autonomous rebel suppression. After sitting around waiting for pan-nationalists for quite some time, I started feeling uncertain whether there was even a realistic chance they would rise up at all. To combat this uncertainty, I made a save, exited the game, and then reloaded that same save again to do some scouting. Specifically, I checked around in the various German miners to see which ones, if any, had pan-nationalist rebel movements brewing. To make this more efficient, I made use of the console, tag switch between them, rather than constantly exiting and re-entering the game as different tags. I want to make it clear though that I did this entirely separately from actually progressing through the run. To ensure there was a distinct cut between playing the run and investigating like this, I always made a save and exited the run before loading up the save again to experiment with it. When it was done, I exited the game again and loaded the save back up to continue the run for real. I did similar things a number of times throughout the run, both on and off camera. I'll be the first to admit that using methods like these to gain additional information that wouldn't be directly visible otherwise feels a bit iffy when it comes to the legitimacy of the run, but overall I don't think it gave me much practical benefits in the game itself. It was more for the sake of my own peace of mind. Still, I wanted to mention it for the sake of transparency. After many long years of gradually absorbing Indian princes, I was finally ready to finish my war with the UK by completing the Liberation-Conquest of India. With that, Asia was beginning to look pretty well filled in, especially as I've been picking off smaller uncivs here and there over the years. Going forward, I would generally leave the uncivs be unless they had more than 4 states left and or were getting close to westernizing. Establish Protectorate is a war goal that is only available against uncivs that are 4 states or fewer, and it's quicker to justify than almost any other war goal in the game. Once an unciv westernizes, I'd have to rely on the Conquest war goal to annex them, which is both much slower to justify and requires the country to be down to a single state. But as long as an unciv isn't too close to westernization, it's better to save them for later, as it can be nice to have the option to squeeze in a quick war whenever I'm getting close to the diplopoint cap. Speaking of which, Egypt was getting a bit too close to westernizing for my convert, so I wanted to finish them off soon. This was complicated by the fact that I wanted to do a liberation conquest for Egypt's cores from the Ottomans, and thanks to an unusually aggressive Ethiopia, I also had the opportunity to do the same with them. I was already fighting the Ottomans to take a couple of other states though, and was simultaneously trying to force rebels in their satellites Moldavia and Wallachia so I could mop them up too. This meant I had to drag out the war with Egypt for many more years than would have otherwise been necessary. But in the end I got a very large chunk of land out of it, and finally got to connect my territories in Africa and Asia. Another large chunk of land I was eyeing up was Canada. They too were a viable target for the Liberation Conquest exploit by liberating their cores from the UK. And due to some typical vanilla shenanigans, the US had also colonized a couple of Canadian cores that could be liberated at the same time. I figured now was a good time to do it, before any smaller breakaway states like Quebec or Colombia had a chance to rear their ugly heads. But I soon realized that it wasn't actually a good time at all. In fact, it was such a bad time to do it that I ended up performing my second save scam of the run just to undo the annexation. I still went through with liberating the Canadian cores from the UK and USA, but I kept the war with Canada itself going since I still had the Conquest war goal on them and could annex them anytime I wanted. But why would it be such a bad idea to annex Canada at this time? Weird, huh? Having to save scum yet again didn't feel great. But don't worry, I would soon have to start save scumming a lot more. You see, throughout all of this, I was still patiently waiting for German pan-nationalists to do their thing, but I was getting more and more concerned that it just wasn't going to happen. Occasionally, pan-nationalist rebels did rise up in one of the German minors, but they would either get beaten down by that country's armies, or they would simply disappear without warning, likely because the country passed a reform to lower militancy. It was frustrating beyond belief to just sit and watch these things transpire while having no way to influence them, especially since I knew that even if some of these rebels managed to enforce their demands, there was no guarantee that Bavaria would actually accept the so-called Crown from the Gutter to form Germany. The chance that a great power will accept this event is very low by default, but increases significantly if the country isn't an absolute monarchy, and even more if the ruling party is liberal. At this time, Bavaria had a Gems government, but the ruling party were socialists, so they had a little under 50% chance to accept the event should it trigger. All in all, there was a fair chance that Germany would eventually form if I just gave it enough time, but the longer it took, the more stressed out I became. Eventually, I reached a point where I couldn't take it anymore, and decided I would start save scumming around the year 1896 and replay the following few years repeatedly until all the stars aligned and Germany formed. It was not fun, especially since there were a bunch of other things going on at the same time that I had to simply repeat over and over. But it eventually paid off. Pan-nationalists enforced their demands somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where, to be honest. And Bavaria accepted the event, thus forming Germany and integrating all but two German states, Anhalt and Luxembourg, because they were sphered by other great powers at the time. I tried to wrestle as many German minors out of the spheres of other great powers as I could, but I didn't have time to get these two, which wasn't too bad. I almost didn't get Austria though, because they were spared by Switzerland, who had managed to become a great power, go figure. Now that would have been too bad. Thankfully, due to having only two states, I could force Switzerland out of great power status by annexing one of those states, thus freeing Austria from their sphere. With Germany finally formed, I could relax again for the first time in many real-life hours of gameplay. And I hoped that with this sorted out, I would not have to resort to save scamming as much anymore. This would prove to be hopelessly naive, but we'll get to that. Soon enough, I declared my first war against the newly formed Germany. Later on, I would be able to conquer the vast majority of it through liberation conquests of Prussia and Austria. But there were a handful of states that didn't have cores of either of those nations and would have to be annexed individually. Since the war score cost of states increased the fewer states the country has in total, while the Liberate Country war goal is always capped at 100 no matter what, it was advantageous for me to take care of all the individual states first, and do the liberation conquests last, as that would make those individual states cheaper to demand. Ever since the USA lost the American Civil War, I have been gradually chipping away at them until they had been reduced down to only their capital. Meanwhile, I hadn't lifted a finger against the CSA, which might seem strange, since they were one of the largest remaining countries in the world, and would surely take many wars to conquer. That is, if I were to conquer them the conventional way. But I wasn't going to conquer them the conventional way. I mentioned earlier how the CSA's successful bid for independence had given me some ideas for a special, as of yet untested strategy. Well, now was the time to put that strategy to the test, and it's related to our old friends, the pan-nationalists. If there is a cultural union that has not yet formed, then if pan-nationalists enforce their demands, the great power of that culture group will get the chance to form the cultural union. That's what happened with Germany earlier. But what happens if the cultural union has already formed? Well, in that case, pan-nationalists can still spawn, but they work a bit differently. Enforcing their demands no longer has any impact, at least not in regards to the cultural union. But if they occupy individual provinces that are cores of the cultural union, those provinces will eventually defect to the cultural union for free. As you may or may not know, there is only one cultural union that exists at the start of the game, and that is none other than the USA. So, after reducing the US down to just their capital, I was able to declare a conquest war on them. Then I declared war on the CSA, but I didn't try to conquer anything from them. Rather, I just destroyed their army and occupied them. Soon enough, American pan-nationalists rose up and began occupying the US cores that covered all of the CSA's territory. One by one, those cores began to defect to the US, whom I still had an active conquest war with. The plan now was, quite simply, to keep that war going until the pan-nationalists had caused the entire CSA to defect back to the USA, and only then would I finish the war with the latter and annex them. In other words, I would perform yet another variation of the Liberation Conquest exploit, which I guess you might call the Defection Conquest exploit or something like that. By the way, in case you're wondering why I didn't just use a conventional Liberation Conquest here, then the answer is that you can't directly liberate the USA's cores from the CSA via a war goal. I believe this is because you can't liberate the cores of a cultural union from a country that belongs to that culture group. Hence, the pan-nationalists are the best option available. That's not to say it's a simple option though. Pan-nationalists are not content with staying within the borders of the nation they reside in. Rather, they will treat national boundaries like the abstract political constructs they are, and march to wherever cores of their cultural union can be found, regardless of what nation currently holds those cores. As a result, after occupying most of CSA's territory, the rebels began to spill over into my territory, and also Mexico's, occupying and defecting American cores as they went. In itself it wasn't a problem if provinces defected in this way, since I'd be able to annex them all again at once anyway. But it did distract the rebels from finishing off the CSA, and once they entered Mexico's borders, I would not be able to defend them against Mexico's armies. Furthermore, it was preferable for me if Mexico got to keep as many American cores as possible, since I would be able to do a liberation conquest for those cores down the line, and in the meantime all other Mexican states would be cheaper to take. With that in mind, this is as good a time as any to talk about rebel manipulation. There are a few important facts to know about rebels. First, most rebels will try to avoid moving into provinces that contain armies hostile to them, at least if the rebels don't greatly outnumber those armies. This can be taken advantage of to make rebels go where you need them to go, which I did by placing armies of my own all along the border to Mexico, thus preventing any American pan-nationalists from crossing over there, and forcing them to focus on the cores they could reach. Second, whenever you load up a save file, the organization of all rebel stacks is set to 0, or at least greatly reduced. Rebels only move if their organization is full, so in situations where you don't want rebels to move around, you can just save and reload the game every now and then to reset their organization. This can also make it easier to fight them if you need to. Third, different rebels can't fight each other or steal occupations from each other. This worked out in my favor here, as I had a bunch of Jacobin rebels that had been occupying most of my stuff in North America, which meant the American pan-nationalists could not occupy and defect those provinces. 4. If a rebel army is currently besieging a province, no other rebel armies will attempt to move into that province to help with the siege. These last 2 points mean it's important to clear out any other rebel types that may pop up in the CSA, to make sure the pan-nationalists can get to and occupy everything themselves. Despite my best efforts, it would take a long time for these rebels to do what I needed them to do, so the wars with the USA and CSA would end up getting dragged out for several decades. This is yet another reason why strategies reliant on rebels are a pain. Now we're beginning to enter the late game. While looking out across the world, things were looking quite good. Most of Asia and Africa was under my boot, but much of what remained in Europe could be conquered swiftly through liberation conquests in Germany and the Ottomans. But there is one part of the world which looked conspicuously unconquered, namely South and Central America. I had taken the Guianas and a couple of states from Brazil earlier, but otherwise it all looked completely untouched, despite the fact that some of these countries are actually pretty big and might require many wars to conquer. So why had I left them mostly intact for so long? Well, it was around this time that a certain problem was beginning to manifest. But not just any problem. This problem was the single greatest threat to the entire campaign. In fact, this problem was what single-handedly ruined my first attempt at the Mayen world conquest. Because of that, from the very beginning of this attempt, I had been keeping it in mind and continuously taken measures to attempt to prevent it. Remember all those times in the video where I did things that seemingly made little sense, but didn't elaborate on? Why were two of the states I annexed in this war landlocked, even though Russia has plenty of coastal states left to choose from? Weird, huh? One of the demands I made was to return Belize to the USCA. Now, why did I do that rather than just taking it for myself? Weird, huh? The US was allied to both the USCA and their breakaway state Costa Rica, but I didn't take any territory from them. Weird, huh? But why would I want to turn Russian states into colonies? Weird, huh? But why would it be such a bad idea to annex Canada at this time? Weird, huh? What if I told you that every single one of these decisions were made for the purpose of mitigating this one problem? And now that it's starting to become a reality, I'm finally ready to talk about it more thoroughly. The problem that threatens to ruin the entire campaign is Swedish people. I'm not even joking. To be clear, I'm not talking about the nation of Sweden, I really mean just the Swedish pops. Let me clarify. As I explained much earlier in the video, revanchism is an essential ingredient in any world conquest in this game, since that's what grants you enough jingoism growth to continuously add war goals. The amount of revanchism you have depends on the proportion of core provinces you own versus core provinces you don't own. The only core province I owned was my capital, while I had two additional cores on Västlandet held by Sweden. But the same generic coring event that gave me those last two cores could potentially create cores in other provinces I owned. That event can only trigger in a province that meets certain conditions though. Most notably that the province needs to either border an existing core province or have a majority of your primary or accepted cultures. That last condition is the one that may cause trouble. Mayen has Norwegian as primary culture, and its accepted cultures include Swedish and polar bear. You might think this should mean that unwanted cores wouldn't be much of a problem. By default, all Swedish and Norwegian pops are confined to the Nordic region, and there are no polar bear pops at all. So as long as I don't conquer anything around there, I should be safe, right? That might have been true if not for emigration and assimilation. As soon as I get my hands on a new state, there's a chance Swedish and or Norwegian pops will begin to emigrate there. And once a few have established themselves, they may begin to assimilate the other cultures in the state, possibly to the point that they become the majority. For whatever reason, I never had much trouble with Norwegian immigrants in this game, but the same could not be said for Swedish ones. Not all provinces are created equal, however, and some are far more vulnerable to Swedification than others. New World provinces have far higher immigration and assimilation rates than Old World provinces, and provinces with lower populations and or less culturally homogeneous populations don't require as many Swedish immigrants before they become a majority. Technically, they don't even need to become a proper majority, they just need to be the largest culture within the province, which is why culturally diverse provinces are more vulnerable than homogeneous ones. Lastly, provinces with a large amount of pops that are the primary culture of a nation that has cores there are more resilient, since those pops will never assimilate. Most states in Europe are unlikely to become a problem for these reasons, but there are states in other regions of the world that can be more troublesome. Any state in the Americas can become a problem due to the high rates of immigration and assimilation, as can states in Siberia and the Sahara due to their low populations. But the absolute worst are states that combine the two, i.e. low pop states in the Americas. If a province ends up with a majority of Swedish pops, it's likely to trigger the coring event eventually. And if this happens in too many provinces, revanchism will plummet, and it will become impossible to add war goals quickly enough to finish the world conquest. So, what have I been doing all game to prevent this outcome? Well, first of all, I've been holding off on conquering potential problem spots for as long as possible. The coring event has a rather long mean time to happen, so the later I acquire such states, the lower the chance that they will spawn cores before the end of the game. In regards to the Americas, the longer I wait, the more time the low pop regions will have to grow from immigration, and thus become less vulnerable. That's why I left South and Central America alone for so long, and is also the reason I ended up save-scumming my original annexation of Canada. Second, if you recall from earlier in the game, I had a particular focus on conquering low pop colonies from civilized countries. That's because the coring event can't fire in colonial states, and low pop colonies can be more easily turned into full states, so I wanted to grab as many of them as I could before the AI had time to do that. This is also the reason for all those shenanigans with the split territories in Siberia and Central Asia. If I had conquered the parts of those territories that were Russian states first, and then acquired the parts that were colonial, I would be stuck with the full state parts that all had very low populations, and thus were potential problem spots. But by making sure to acquire the colonial parts first and the full state parts second, the two parts got merged into a single colonial state, and was thus safe from the coring event. I managed to pull off similar things in a few other places as well, but the ones in Russia were the most significant. Then there were the instances, like the time I returned Belize from the UK to the USEA, instead of annexing it directly. Belize had already been turned into a full state at that point, so it would have been risky to take it for myself so early. But the province of Belize is part of the same state as Guatemala, so after returning it to the USEA, I would be able to annex it as part of the same war goal as the rest of Guatemala. In other words, returning it like this did not require any additional war goals, but allowed me to delay owning it until later. I did similar things in a few other places too. For example, returning the Falklands/Las Malvinas from its arguably rightful owner, the United Kingdom, to its arguably rightful owner, Argentina. But of course, I could not put off conquering the potential problem spots forever. Now that we're entering the late game, I had to start thinking about expanding in South America, but many of these states had such low populations that they'd become majority Swedish within a very short amount of time after I conquered them. To deal with that, we need to look at one more condition of the coring event that is very relevant in this case. The event cannot trigger for a province that is under occupation, whether by other nations or by rebels. So what I decided to do was to declare war on the South American nations that only had one state, such as Uruguay and Paraguay, and give them free reins to occupy everything I owned in the region. Because they only had one state, I would be able to annex them anytime I wanted, which meant there was no harm in dragging these wars out until the very end of the run. You only get war exhaustion from occupied provinces in your home continent, so letting them occupy stuff in South America wasn't an issue from that perspective either. Thanks to that, I could ensure no cores would be popping up to ruin my revanchism, but it also meant I would now have to commit myself to be at war for the rest of the campaign. It wasn't too difficult to avoid getting more war exhaustion at this point, since the amount you get from occupations and blockades is inversely proportional to the total number of provinces you own. But I already had a few points of it from before that would be difficult to get rid of if I couldn't be at peace anymore. Thankfully, I received an event that let me lower it a little bit. Then there's the decision, enact women's suffrage, which can be taken after researching social science, and which reduces war exhaustion by another 2 points. This brought it down all the way to 0. Outside of the Americas, I was continuing to eat away at primarily the bigger countries. One of these were the Ottomans, who I was planning on stripping of most states that could not be taken by a liberation conquest. before employing that very exploit to conquer the Greek and Serbian cores. The AI decided to be annoying though, as Germany supported Greece in two separate crises to return two of their states, making liberation conquest less efficient each time. Since Ottomans still had cores on these states, I was hoping they would simply reconquer them at some point, seeing as Greece failed to raise a standing army. But for whatever reason, that never happened. Sometimes it really feels like the AI decides how aggressive it wants to be solely based on what would be the most inconvenient for you as the player. Still, I felt pretty good about the run at this point. There were some worries about unwanted cores cropping up, but overall I felt I had that under control, so all I had to do now was keep going at a steady pace. But then I decided to take a moment to actually count how many war goals I would likely need to finish the world conquest, calculate how many diplo points and how much justification time would be required, and then compare that to how much time I had left. And that's when I made the disturbing discovery that it wouldn't be enough. By my estimate, I'd need at least a few more years to complete the run than I had left. To say that this was disheartening is an understatement, after everything I'd gone through. But I really didn't want to give up, so I began racking my brain trying to come up with a solution to this conundrum. One possible salvation could be bonus war goals gained through events. There are a number of events that may trigger in different circumstances that give you free war goals, most of which are not for conquering land, but they at least let you skip the war justification time. For example, if a country goes bankrupt, it'll give you a repay debts casus belli. Or if a country becomes a proletariat dictatorship and performs nationalization while you have previously invested in them, it'll give you a make puppet CB. Then there's the event that can give you a cut down to size CB against an uncivilized country that is part of your sphere of influence, which prompted me to begin adding all remaining uncivs to my sphere. In the end, I did get a couple of such free CBs, but I knew it was very unlikely I'd get enough of them to meet my final deadline. Then I had another idea. I figured out there was one other way to get into war with another country without having to justify it in advance, and unlike the event CVs, this method was perfectly consistent and did not rely on RNG at all. However, it would require taking some rather drastic measures, and I would need more time to prepare for it, so I'll get back to that later. Meanwhile, there was another issue at hand. A rather serious issue, in fact. I said earlier that the greatest threat to the run was the unwanted cores that might spawn in Swedish majority provinces to ruin my revanchism. Now, this is true from a game mechanics perspective, but there is something else that's arguably an even bigger threat, only from a psychological perspective. In fact, without exaggerating, I can say that this thing very nearly drove me to just straight up abandon the attempt, even this close to the end. And of course, that thing was... If you've ever played Victoria 2 into the late game, particularly in an expansionist playthrough, you'll be well familiar with just how relentless late game rebellions can be. But trust me when I say that nothing compares to the sheer soul-crushing weight of late game rebellions in a world conquest run. I've mentioned how rebellions start to become a real problem after conquering most of China and India, but it's not too bad so long as you can still pass reforms. But around the year 1909, I passed the last reform I had available, and from then on, I was in hell. Anarcho-liberals, communists, the odd Jacobin, and eventually fascists took turn rising up against me. And once it started, it did not stop. They just kept coming. Now normally, if you get a big rebellion and you manage to crush it, your militancy will go down, so you can expect a breather for a few years at least. But due to the time pressure I was under, I had no choice but to constantly add on more and more militancy. To save on justification time, I rarely justified acquire state or conquest war goals directly anymore, since they take twice as long to justify as most other war goals. Instead, I typically went for faster war goals like dismantle fortifications, and only added the territorial war goals after the war had begun. The problem with this is that I didn't always have the war score to spare for enforcing those initial war goals, but when you fail to enforce a war goal, you gain a bit of militancy. On top of that, I also had to truce break a fair bit against some of the larger countries, to ensure truce timers would not become a problem, which also adds a bunch of militancy. So no matter how many rebellions I crushed, new ones were constantly popping up to replace them. In my old World Conquest video, I mentioned how the worst thing about rebellions was the extreme lag that comes with them. For whatever reason, that wasn't much of a problem this time, maybe because I have a much better computer now, but instead there were other problems. As I said earlier, one way to prevent cores from spawning is to make sure a potential problem spot is under constant occupation. In places like South America, I could achieve that by letting small countries like Uruguay and Paraguay occupy things freely, but I eventually started having trouble with Swedish majority provinces in Siberia and in the state of Tripoli in the Sahara. These were too far away from any smaller countries to occupy them, so the only other option was to let rebels occupy them instead. In this way, the massive rebellions actually had some upsides, but it also meant I couldn't rely on autonomous rebel suppression anymore, since I had to make sure my armies didn't retake any of those provinces I actually wanted the rebels to control. As a result, I was forced to painstakingly micromanage every rebel hunting army individually, which led to the following gameplay loop. Unpause the game, let it run for a single day, then pause it again. Click your way through every message about the battle or siege against rebels that popped up on that day, and issue new orders to the armies that were involved. Then unpause the game and repeat. Every single day, for months or even years without break. What makes this even worse is a particular mechanic which I believe is a bug that I only discovered during this run and which prompted the biggest instance of save scumming I ever did. After slugging through rebels for a while, I discovered that I was somehow gaining war exhaustion from blockaded home ports, and was gaining it fast. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find any enemy fleets that were blockading me. That's when I realized that, for some fucking reason, when rebels occupy your coastal provinces on your home continent, it counts as hostile blockades for the purposes of war exhaustion. This blew my goddamn mind, because it makes absolutely no sense at all. First of all, rebel occupations aren't supposed to give you war exhaustion at all. Like, if rebels occupy inland provinces on your home continent, it does nothing. Second of all, if armies from an enemy nation occupy your coastal provinces, it does give you war exhaustion, but only under the label occupied home provinces. It does not count as hostile blockades. So why on earth would rebel occupations of coastal provinces count as blockades? This caught me completely off guard, and by the time I realized what was going on, my war exhaustion had already grown to untenable levels, and I had no choice but to reload a save from several years earlier, or else I likely would not be able to complete the run on time. In my old World Conquest video, I mentioned that one way to escape a particularly bad rebellion is to simply let them win, by occupying your capital, as that would make all rebels of that faction go away. Sadly, that was not an option in this campaign. First, due to its low population, rebels rarely spawned on Mayen itself, and since rebels can't move across water in this game, there was no other way for them to possibly take my capital. But even when rebels did spawn there, I couldn't let them win, because that would also remove any occupations their factions had done, including on the Swedish majority provinces that I had actually wanted them to occupy. Furthermore, if the rebels won, there's a good chance I would get stuck with some form of dictatorship that wouldn't let me call elections. I wanted to keep the option to call elections open, just in case I'd run into a shortage of jingoism later, and needed the jingoism from certain election events as a backup. As such, my only option for dealing with the rebels was to hunt them down, one stack at a time. The Reset Rebel organization by reloading the game trick was a godsend during this time, since it made battles easier and prevented rebels from moving around. But even with that to help, it was a nightmare. To put into perspective just how slow this part of the run was, consider this. My rebel problem started to become really bad around 1907, and I only started getting it under control around 1919. The 71 in-game years between the start of the run in 1836 and the year 1907 took 63 hours of real time to play through. Wanna guess how long the following 12 years between 1907 and 1919 took? 32 hours! Yes, I played for roughly one half the number of real-time hours, but only progressed roughly 1/6 the number of in-game years. That's roughly the same amount of real-time that my entire Mongol Empire playthrough took. Now, to be fair, I did do a fair bit of save scamming during that time, so I did replay some of those 12 years more than once. But still, I've been thinking to myself whether I would recommend other people to attempt a world conquest of their own in Victoria 2, sort of as an advanced challenge for experienced players. Throughout most of this campaign, my answer would probably have been yes. Even though it can be very slow and tedious at times, overall the strategic challenges and the sheer dopamine hit whenever you annex a large chunk of territory after a long and gruesome war makes it a pretty fun run in my opinion. At least the fun and satisfying parts are good enough to outweigh the tedious parts. But despite that, at the end of the day, I cannot in good conscience recommend this challenge after all. And it's 100% the fault of these fucking rebels. When they really get going, they instantly suck all the joy out of the game. Thing is, dealing with them isn't difficult in the slightest. Rebels don't benefit from military technology at all as far as I'm aware, so no matter how many they are, they will always melt like butter in the face of your late game armies. And as long as they don't reach your capital, they can never enforce their demands, no matter how much of the rest of the country they occupy. So in the end, they are nothing more than a complete and utter waste of time, the only real threat they pose being to your sanity. If I hadn't planned on making a video out of this, I seriously doubt I would have kept going to the end. And I think I'll probably have PTSD from the damn rebel uprising sound effect for the rest of my life. Anyway, I said that the worst rebel problems lasted until around 1919. So what changed then? Well, it was then that I was able to implement a certain strategy for managing militancy that finally brought the nightmare to an end. The only awkward thing about it is that it relies on giving complete control of your government to the fascists. I swear it's not my fault though. The way the game mechanics work, it's pretty much impossible to complete a world conquest without ending up with a fascist government by the end, whether you want it or not. That's because the conditions that determine whether a given mob will be drawn toward a fascist ideology are the exact same as those that determine whether it will be drawn toward jingoism. In other words, high revanchism will both give you a lot of jingoism and a lot of fascism. Now, it's possible I might have hurried this along a bit by using my national focuses to encourage fascist support in those states that have the largest numbers of accepted pops, but that's only because making at least 50% of your upper house fascist is the key to this militancy management strategy I've been hinting at. You see, different ideologies have different attitudes toward political and social reforms. Some support political reforms, some support social reforms, some support rolling back reforms, etc. But the fascists are unique in that their attitude towards reforms depend on whether they are currently the ruling party or not. If they are not, they will refuse to support any reform whatsoever and won't support rolling back reforms either. But if they are, they will make a complete 180 and instead support both enacting and rolling back every reform. This is incredibly useful for militancy management, because as it turns out, you don't lose militancy solely from passing reforms, but also from rolling back reforms. So if you can get fascists in power, from then on you can continuously pass and roll back the same reform over and over every 6 months, and you'll hardly ever need to worry about militancy again. But it's not enough to just put a fascist party in power. You first need to wait until fascist support has risen enough to allow at least 50% of your upper house to become fascist. Before then, even if the fascists support rolling back a reform, it won't be possible if every other ideology is against it. But once they have 50% of the upper house, they can push through whatever they want single-handedly. That's why it took all the way to 1919 before I could put this reform strategy into action. I maybe could have gotten it going sooner by allowing fascist rebels to enforce a fascist dictatorship on me instead. But as I said before, I want to avoid dictatorships because I might need the ability to call elections later on. By the way, what do you think a young Mayen fascist would even be like? Polar bear supremacy? Unfortunate real-world parallels aside, I could finally breathe again. I'd managed to make a bit of progress with conquest while slogging through rebel hell, but time was quickly running out. Fortunately, with a new reform strategy in place, I could begin to put my drastic plans to save the campaign into action. In preparation for this, I had been steadily building up forts all over Europe. I always forget to build forts in this game, but I realized they would be very helpful for what I'm about to do. On top of that, I had been putting as many minor powers into my sphere of influence as possible. The final piece of the puzzle was the aforementioned reform strategy to keep my militancy as low as possible. You see, aside from militancy itself, another thing that determines the likelihood for a rebel movement to take up arms is the relative size of your military versus the number of rebel regiments ready to rise up. In other words, if your army is too small, you'll have a much higher risk of rebellion, and obviously you'll have a much more difficult time crushing the rebellion once it triggers. Why am I explaining this now, you might ask? Yep, I just disbanded my entire army. Now, why would I do that? That's why. This was my drastic plan to save the campaign. If I don't have time to justify and declare war on all these AI nations, I'll just have to encourage them to declare war on me instead. And to do that, I just need to make myself look weak. This would not have been feasible if I still had as much militancy as before, as I would have immediately gotten swamped by rebels. So I had to wait for the new reform strategy to come online before I could do this. Of course, if I were to remain without the military for long, I'd get swamped by enemy armies instead. So as soon as I deleted my original armies, I started recruiting new ones. But I was very meticulous about it, picking out individual provinces on the map to recruit from in order to make sure they'd be close to the action, but not too close, and that they could be assembled into well-balanced stacks quickly. All those forts I built were there to slow my enemies down, which was important within Europe since any occupations there would contribute to war exhaustion. Things got a bit hectic nonetheless, but in the end I managed to get new armies up and running and could face down and defeat all those who attacked me. This first round of wars would save me a lot of time, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. I had to keep justifying and fighting wars on other fronts as well, and in many cases I would need to resort to truce breaking. To minimize the risk of any more major rebellions, I let my newly built regiments remain for the time being, while I went around the world dealing with some errands. This mostly included continued wars in South and Central America, where I found little optimizations here and there, mostly in the form of mini-liberation conquests involving Paraguay, Bolivia, and Chile, as well as Venezuela, who had previously had all but their capital overtaken by Gran Colombian separatists. Once I had a conquest war goal added to a given nation, I generally opted to keep that war going rather than ending it, again for the sake of avoiding unwanted cores. After doing some more conventional warfare, I did another round of my little army deletion gambit, and got a few more wars in that way. The way things were going though, it seemed most AI nations weren't too keen on declaring war on me by their own accord, even at times when I had no army. This was not great. If I couldn't get more nations to declare on me, it might not be enough to complete the run. But if they weren't willing to declare war on me by their own accord, I suppose I'd just have to force them to do it. This is where the third element of my preparations comes into play, adding countries to my sphere. As you may or may not know, if a secondary power is in the sphere of a great power and their mutual relations drop below zero, the secondary power gains access to a decision allowing them to leave the sphere. When that happens, the great power receives an event which essentially boils down to either letting the secondary power go without a fuss, or automatically declaring war on them to force them back into the fold. As you can probably guess, I'd be able to take advantage of this by sphering a secondary power and then letting them try to leave my sphere, thus giving me the option to declare war on them without needing war justification. However, an AI secondary power will only take this decision if their army is at least 1/3 the size of the sphere leaders, and some of the remaining nations have literally no standing army at all. So disbanding my army completely is necessary to make this work. But this method has one distinct advantage over simply allowing an AI nation to declare war on me as normal. If the right conditions are met, the AI will always take this decision immediately with 100% consistency. That effectively eliminates the unreliability in the AI's normal war declaration logic. Normally, the game only allows 8 secondary powers at a time, but if there should happen to be fewer than 8 countries left that are eligible to become great powers, i.e. if they are either uncivilized or have only a single state, then any country within the top 16 that isn't eligible for great power status will instead be considered a secondary power, allowing for more than the usual 8. This was the case by the time I approached the endgame. However, while my initial plan was to just add every secondary power to my sphere and then delete my army so I could fight them all at once, I discovered that wouldn't work. If multiple spherelings take this decision on the same day, I'll only receive the event to declare war on one of them, while the rest get to become independent without me getting the chance to interfere. To get around that, what I ended up doing was raising my influence to 100 in each of them, but without actually adding them to my sphere. Then when the time was right, I deleted my army and proceeded to add them to my sphere one at a time, letting the game progress one day between each of them. That way, only one of them would take the decision per day, allowing me to receive the event to declare war on all of them. Then it was just a matter of raising armies in various places around the world and defeating them all. With all these secondary powers taken care of using this method, I had more than enough time and diplo points to clean up everything else in more conventional ways. All the bigger countries were gradually swallowed up, occasionally with the help of liberation conquests such as for Germany, the Ottomans, and the UK. I could also annex the USA eventually, after the American pan-nationalists finally finished defecting all of the CSA, and then I could also do a liberation conquest for the US cores held by Mexico. Texas managed to break free from Mexico via rebels at some point, but they could be included in the whole secondary power break from sphere ploy, so that's not a big deal. But although most of the world had been taken care of, there was one glaring omission: Sweden. Even with only a few short years left in the game, they remained entirely untouched. This is of course because their territory was filled to the brim with pops of my primary and accepted cultures, and so conquering them too early would certainly devastate my revanchism. I also knew that I could safely leave them until the end, because the cores I had on Westlandet meant I possessed a permanent casus belli on them, which I'd be able to use to repeatedly truce break over and over, and thus be able to conquer them very quickly when I needed to. There was just one complication that I had to watch out for. I would only be able to truce break them as long as I still owned Westlandet, but I would have to conquer Westlandet before I'd have the chance to take their capital. In other words, when it came to annexing their final state, I would no longer be able to truce break. I had already realized this long ago, and had been pondering how to get around it. I'd considered a number of possible solutions, each with their own flaws, but eventually I stumbled upon one which was better than all the others. It's based around a certain casus belli that becomes available after you research nationalism and imperialism. If you're a great power and there's another great power in the same culture group as you, and that great power has spared a third country but is also in the same culture group as you receive a special custom ability called Assert Hegemony. It has the effect of transferring all spherelings of your culture group from the other great power to you. In a normal game, you'll most commonly see this in the form of the German Brothers' War between Prussia and Austria. In this case, both me and Sweden are great powers belonging to the Scandinavian culture group. And you know who else belongs to the Scandinavian culture group, and who just so happens to be part of Sweden's sphere of influence? Denmark. Which results in me receiving a free Assert Hegemony CB against Sweden, which I can use to truce break even after reconquering my cores on Westlandet. But wait a minute. Assert Hegemony is only valid as long as Denmark remains in Sweden's sphere. But as we've established earlier, a country can't be a great power if it only has one state remaining. So once I've reduced Sweden down to just their capital, they would drop from great power and thus lose Denmark as a sphereling. So that means this plan won't work after all, right? Well, what if I told you that the idea that a country needs to have more than one state in order to be a great power is a lie? Okay, maybe not a lie exactly, just not universally true. There is in fact one situation where a single state nation can be a great power, but it's not surprising that hardly anyone knows about it, because it only ever comes up in a world conquest. If there are no more than 8 countries eligible to become great powers left in the world, and one of these great powers is reduced down to a single state, they will retain their great power status, presumably because there is no one else available to replace them. This is the only way the game allows a single state great power to exist. If there is a single state country that isn't already a great power, and there are fewer than 8 eligible great powers left, that country still can't become a great power while only having one state. It's only if they already were a great power that they may keep that status after being reduced to a single state. With that in mind, you can understand how this pertains to our current situation. By the time I finished my penultimate war with Sweden, there only remained a handful of countries that had more than one state. As such, Sweden was allowed to keep their great power status despite only having their capital left. That meant Denmark remained in their sphere, and I got to keep my free casus belli. All that was left to do then was use that casus belli to declare one final war, add conquest war goals on both Sweden and Denmark. Denmark was allied to Sweden, by the way, that's why they were part of this war too, and finish the run. Is what I would have said if not for the fact that I didn't have enough Diplo points left. As I was nearing the end of 1935, the final year of the game, I needed around 5 more Diplo points in order to add the final war goals on Sweden and Denmark, plus Orange and Transvaal, that I was also at war with but hadn't gotten around to finishing yet. But there just wasn't enough time left to generate those Diplo points before the game would end. So, after everything that's happened, I failed just before the finish line. This would have felt devastating if not for the fact that I had been save-scumming so much these last few decades that I had become rather desensitized to it. I haven't mentioned every single time I did it, because honestly, I don't even remember every time I did it, but most of it was to correct mistakes that weren't too bad on their own, and which I probably would have let slide earlier in the run. But due to how tight on time I felt I was near the end, I would rather not take any chances. Then there were several instances where, despite my best efforts to prevent it, I ended up gaining cores in a number of provinces, and so I had to save scum to manipulate the RNG to avoid triggering the coring event. I didn't do it every time it happened though. Since I had 66% revanchism before those cores started cropping up, I could afford to gain quite a lot of them before my revanchism would drop below 20%, which is the threshold for gaining the maximum possible bonus to jingoism growth. But I had to do it on occasion nonetheless. Then there was this last mistake, or rather miscalculation. I had been too careless with my Diplo points during the final stretch of the game, but I knew I could correct that by reloading a save from a few years before the end, and being just a little bit more efficient. In particular, after getting into war with all those secondary powers, I needed to add conquest war goals on each of them, but my jingoism was initially very low, and I had to wait a rather long time for it to reach the 7% threshold. In the meantime, I reached the diplopoint cap of 9 and spent at least a few months without generating any more, before I could start using them again. So to avoid that happening again, I needed to find a way to increase my jingoism faster at this particular moment. And wouldn't you know it, I had planned for just such an occasion, back when I made sure not to let any rebels turn me into a dictatorship. Thanks to that, I was still able to hold elections. Thus, I could rely on election events to give me the temporary boost to jingoism I needed. Or well, at least I had a chance to get a temporary boost, but there's a lot of RNG with election events, and I didn't have the time to run through multiple elections just to get the event I needed. So once again I had to save scam multiple times until things went my way. I'm not too happy about it, as I think save scamming for the sake of RNG manipulation feels even less legitimate than doing it merely to fix mistakes. But I do think that I only had to do this RNG manipulation now because I made some entirely avoidable mistakes earlier, so a successful run without any RNG manipulation should still be possible in theory. Anyway, with that taken care of, I had made sure that I would have enough diplo points to finish the run on time. Before we wrap things up though, I'd just like to take a moment to mention a few things. First, I want to once again give a huge shout out to Darvas, the author of the old Greece World Conquest AOR, Heaven Cannot Brook Two Sons, nor Earth Two Masters. It's no exaggeration to say that my Mayen world conquest would never have been possible if not for the groundwork done by Darvas all these years ago. I will link to the AAR in the description and highly recommend it to anyone who wants an even more detailed look at the things I've talked about here. Second, like I said near the beginning of the video, I've got the full unedited gameplay footage from this run uploaded as unlisted videos on my second channel. But if you want a more digestible overview of the run, I also have a custom time-lapse video I uploaded recently which shows not only the evolution of the world map over the course of the run, but even shows the movement of armies and navies, plus various other data. I'll link to that video as well if you haven't seen it already. And third, in this video we witnessed an alternate reality where a nation of polar bears came to dominate the world. But in our normal reality, polar bears aren't doing so hot. Or rather, the problem is that they're doing far too hot. With every passing year, their natural habitat in the Arctic is shrinking due to climate change. And if this trend continues, they soon won't have a natural habitat at all. If you want to do your part for the glory of the John Mayen Empire, then consider reading about and maybe donating to Polar Bears International. They're an organization dedicated to the conservation of and education about polar bears and the Arctic in general. I'll link to that in the description as well. And just to be clear, this video isn't sponsored or anything, I just felt it'd be amiss not to bring at least some attention to this issue in a video like this. Anyway, with that said, let us end the video by watching me annex the final batch of countries in real time. Thank you for watching.